The wind howled through the glen like a ghost that never rested. It wrapped around the jagged stones of a half-crumbled cottage, rattled the wooden shutters, and carried with it the bite of cold rain and peat smoke. In the heart of medieval Scotland, this was just another day. For the people who lived here, farmers, shepherds, blacksmiths, and warriors, life didn't offer comfort. It offered challenge. And for most, it offered hardship. Yet they endured, not because they wanted to, but because they had no other choice. On the edge of the Highlands, where the hills seemed to fold into each other like waves frozen in time, a boy named Callan crouched beside a muddy path, his fingers numb with cold. He couldn't have been more than 10 years old, but his eyes, gray and sharp, held the weight of someone much older. He had lost both his parents to fever last winter. Now he lived with his uncle, a hard man with a limp and a sharp tongue, in a one-room hut that smelled of boiled oats and wet wool. Most days, Callan helped tend the sheep. On worse days, he stole turnips from neighbors just to keep his belly from aching. And today felt like one of those worst days. Life in medieval Scotland was never gentle. Every meal had to be earned, every fire fed by hands worn rough with work. There were no safety nets, no warm hospitals, no grocery shops, no police to call if something went wrong. Your safety came from the people in your clan, and even they could turn on you when land or cattle were involved. Clans ruled the Highlands like kingdoms of their own, each fiercely loyal and often suspicious of outsiders. If a stranger showed up on your land without permission, you had two options: offer him bread or run him off with a blade. But Callan wasn't thinking about clans or strangers today. He was thinking about the sound he had heard just past the tree line, a low grunt, followed by a snap. Not the kind of snap a squirrel might make, but something heavier, something human. He hesitated. In these woods, there were more than just animals. Bandits roamed the roads, taking what they wanted and vanishing like mist. Some people swore witches lived deep in the forest, and others spoke of the fair folk, spirits who could twist your mind and steal your soul if you looked at them the wrong way. But curiosity was a strong thing, and hunger made it stronger. If someone had dropped a sack of food, or even firewood, that could mean the difference between surviving the week or not. Callan crept forward, careful not to snap any twigs. His bare feet were soaked through, but he didn't notice the cold anymore. That was just part of life here. Pain came with the morning, and it usually stayed until nightfall. The forest thickened quickly, the ground soft with moss and rotting leaves. The further he went, the darker it grew, even though it was still mid-afternoon. Scotland's skies were never truly clear, always heavy with clouds that hung like wool soaked in sorrow. Back in the village, others were carrying their own weights. Ailey, the healer, was boiling bark and roots to make a salve for the blacksmith's infected arm. She had lost her daughter during childbirth a year before, and her hands trembled sometimes when she thought no one was watching. Fergus, the tanner, was cursing at a torn hide, his breath visible in the cold air. He had been in 3 clan battles by the time he turned 25 and now bore the scars of each. These people didn't talk much about pain, they lived with it. They carried it like they carried firewood or pails of water. Heavy, but necessary. Callan pushed past a row of pine trees and stopped cold. There, lying in a shallow ditch, was a man. At first, Callan thought he was dead, but then the man stirred, groaning low. Blood stained the front of his tunic, and one arm looked twisted at a strange angle. His face was pale, his beard matted with sweat and dirt. But what struck Callan most were his eyes that looked too alert for someone so injured. Eyes that didn't seem to match the rest of him. Yet, the man croaked, reaching out with his good hand. "Help me." Callan didn't move. His heart beat hard against his ribs. This wasn't just any man. His cloak was finer than anything the villagers wore, though it was torn and stained. He had the look of someone who wasn't supposed to be here. Not someone from Callan's world. A noble? A traveler? A spy? "Who are you?" Callan whispered. The man didn't answer. His hand dropped, and his eyes fluttered closed. Back in the village, things were changing too. A rider had arrived at the edge of the settlement, tall, silent, dressed in dark leathers. He asked for no food, offered no greetings. He just stared at the mountains in the distance and then turned back the way he came. Those who saw him didn't speak his name, but they felt it. Something was coming. And in medieval Scotland, something coming was rarely something good. As the sky darkened and wind picked up again, Callan stood over the fallen man, unsure what to do. If he helped him, he could bring trouble to his uncle's home. If he left him, he might die. But something inside Callan whispered that this man mattered. That whatever brought him here, bleeding in the woods, would change everything. For him, for the village, maybe even for the clans themselves. The first drops of sleep began to fall cold and sharp. Callan swallowed and knelt beside the man. He didn't know it yet, but this decision, this one moment, would pull him into a world far beyond sheep and stolen turnips. A world of secrets, betrayal, and ancient rivalries. A world where survival meant more than just food and fire. It meant learning who to trust and who was waiting in the dark. And just beyond the trees, watching from the shadows, someone else was already there. Watching, waiting, ready to act. Once the boy made his choice. Callan's hands shook as he reached for the man's shoulder. The blood was warm, sticky. The man stirred again, but didn't open his eyes. Callan didn't know what to do. He had no healing knowledge, no herbs, no idea if the man's injuries were fatal. But he knew enough to understand this man needed shelter. Fast, and if someone had done this to him, they might still be close. He glanced over his shoulder, heart thudding, then leaned in and whispered, "Can you walk?" No answer, just a soft groan. Callan had no strength to carry a grown man, but he could drag him. Not far, just back to the thicket near the edge of the woods out of sight. From there, maybe he could get his uncle's old sled. If he brought it quietly enough, maybe no one would notice. Maybe he wouldn't have to explain anything. That, of course, was wishful thinking. He crouched and took hold of the man's good arm, gritting his teeth as he began to pull. The weight was worse than he expected, and the man's boots dragged through the undergrowth, catching on every root and stone. But Callan didn't stop. His muscles burned, but he kept going inch by inch. The air smelled like pine and damp moss. Every sound felt too loud. His breath, the snapping twigs, the man's groans. At last, they reached the thicket, and Callan let the man rest against a mossy log. His own chest heaved with exhaustion. Rain had begun to fall properly now, soaking his hair, running down the back of his neck. He knew he had to go. He needed to get the sled before dark fully set in. He took one last look at the man, whose face seemed paler than before. "I'll come back," he whispered. "Just stay alive." Then he turned and ran. Back in the village, the wind was tugging at shutters and blowing smoke sideways from chimneys. Most folk had retreated indoors, except for a few who still moved about, stacking firewood, tending to livestock, or just keeping a wary eye on the storm brewing above the hills. Inside a small hut near the center of the village, Ailey the healer was sorting dried herbs into clay jars, her fingers moving slowly, methodically. She stopped briefly, staring at a bundle of dried yarrow in her hand. For a moment, she didn't know why she'd picked it up. Then she remembered it helped stop bleeding. She placed it down and rubbed her temples. Something wasn't right. She felt it in her bones. She stepped to the window, peering out through the rippled glass. The village looked the same, but there was a tension in the air, a feeling that something had shifted. She had lived long enough to know the signs. Trouble didn't always arrive with a shout. Sometimes it slipped in quietly, like a fox in the night. Out near the edge of the village, Callan had reached his uncle's hut. The sled was leaning beside the woodpile, partially covered in old cloth. He glanced toward the door, unsure whether his uncle was inside. If he was, there'd be questions, and Callan didn't have any good answers. He crept around the side, careful not to step on the creaky board near the front step. The sled was heavier than he remembered. He tugged it free and began to pull it back toward the woods, his arms and legs aching with effort. Each step felt slower than the last, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Meanwhile, far beyond the village, in the deeper folds of the Highland hills, two riders were making their way through the mist. Their cloaks were dark, their horses large and restless. One rider spoke softly in Gaelic, his voice low and clipped. "We're too late." The other didn't respond. There was blood at the edge of the river, and tracks. Someone's taken him. Then we follow. The first rider nodded. The horses moved forward, hooves muffled by the wet earth. Callan returned to the thicket just as the light began to fail. Shadows stretched long across the forest floor, and the rain had turned to sleet. He was soaked through, shivering and breathing hard. But the man was still there, still breathing. Barely. "I've got you," Callan muttered, more to himself than anyone else. He rolled the man gently onto the sled, teeth clenched against the weight and the awkwardness. The man let out a sharp cry, but didn't wake. His arm hung strangely, still twisted. Callan covered him with the old cloth, hoping it would be enough to shield him from the cold. Then came the hardest part, dragging the sled home. The path was slick with mud, and the runners caught on roots and rocks. Callan stumbled more than once, nearly dropping the rope that looped around his hands. But with each step, he pushed forward. It took nearly an hour to reach the hut. His uncle wasn't there. That was both a relief and a worry. Callan dragged the man inside, laying him near the hearth. The fire had nearly died. He threw on peat and kindling and sparked it back to life. Warmth bloomed slowly through the room. The man moaned, curling slightly on his side. Now that they were indoors, Callan could see the full extent of his wounds. His tunic had been slashed across the chest. There were bruises on his ribs, his jaw. The arm was clearly broken. Callan didn't know how to fix it, but he knew who might. He had to go back into the village. To Ailey. It would mean questions, possibly punishment. But if he did nothing, the man might not survive the night. He stood, dried his hands on a rag, and grabbed his cloak. The wind had picked up again, hissing through the thatch above his head. He paused before opening the door and glanced at the man one last time. Then he stepped outside and vanished into the rain. Back in the woods, the riders had found the thicket. They dismounted silently. One knelt, touching the spot where the man had lain. "He's gone," he murmured. The second rider scanned the trees. His eyes narrowed. "He's in the village." And without another word, they mounted and turned toward the glow of distant firelight. Back inside Ailey's hut, Callan stood shivering as she packed a bag with linen, salve, and a bottle of bitter-smelling tincture. "You shouldn't have brought him here," she said quietly. "I didn't know what else to do." She nodded once, closing the bag. "He's not just a traveler, Callan. I figured." They left together under the cloak of darkness. The sleet had turned to snow now, falling in heavy, quiet flakes. Somewhere in the distance, wolves howled. But closer still, unseen in the blackness between the trees, the riders moved swiftly, silent and certain. And though Callan didn't know it yet, everything about his quiet life had already changed. The man he saved was carrying more than wounds. He was carrying secrets. Secrets that, once uncovered, would stir clans from their uneasy peace, ignite old grudges, and put a price on the boy's head. The snow kept falling, and somewhere just beyond the edge of sight, the first flames of conflict had already begun to flicker. The snow crunched softly beneath their feet as Callan and Ailey moved through the sleeping village. No torches were lit. No doors creaked open. It was the kind of stillness that made every movement feel louder than it should, and every glance over the shoulder feel like a warning. Ailey walked with purpose, her boots steady and sure on the icy path. Callan followed close behind, his cloak dragging through the snow, heart hammering inside his chest. When they reached the hut, Ailey didn't wait for an invitation. She pushed the door open and stepped into the warmth, the scent of peat smoke curling into her nose. Her eyes fell on the injured man, still lying by the fire, his skin paler now and beaded with sweat. She crossed the room in 3 quick strides and knelt beside him, setting down her bag. "Give me clean water," she said without looking up, "and more peat for the fire." Callan rushed to obey, grabbing the iron pot and stepping back out into the cold. Snowflakes clung to his hair and lashes. He filled the pot from the barrel near the side of the house, then returned inside and handed it over with trembling fingers. Ailey took it, placed it near the fire, and began to unwrap the cloth around the man's chest. Beneath the torn tunic, she found deep bruises, slashes that had only partially clotted, and a shoulder twisted entirely out of place. She breathed out slowly as if steadying herself. This wasn't a fight, she said, mostly to herself. It was a beating, deliberate, methodical. Callan swallowed hard. You think someone wanted him dead? No, she said. If they did, they'd have finished the job. This, she dabbed at the wounds with a cloth soaked in warm water. This was a message. The man stirred. His eyes fluttered open, dazed and unfocused. He looked at Ailey, then Callan, and tried to speak. His voice was nothing more than a hoarse whisper. Where am I? You're safe, Ailey answered softly. For now. He tried to sit up, but she pressed him gently back down. Don't move. You've lost too much blood. I need to find the ledger, he muttered, then coughed violently. Ailey and Callan exchanged a glance. What ledger? Callan asked, stepping closer. The man didn't answer. His eyes rolled back, and he slipped into unconsciousness again. Ailey sighed. We need to set the shoulder. Help me. The next few minutes were a blur of effort and pain. Callan held the man steady as Ailey worked the dislocated arm back into place with a sickening pop. The man screamed, though his eyes remained shut. Once the worst was over, Ailey wrapped the arm in a sling and smeared a pungent salve over the gashes on his chest. They sat in silence for a while afterward. The fire crackled. The wind beat gently against the shutters. Outside, the snow thickened, falling in quiet sheets. Why would someone beat him over a book? Callan asked after a long pause. Ailey stared into the flames. It might not be just any book. If it's a ledger, maybe it holds names, debts, promises, or secrets. Secrets. She nodded. The kind that get men hunted. The boy's thoughts swirled. He tried to imagine what kind of man would risk crossing the Highlands in winter while injured, with a mysterious book and dangerous enemies on his trail. He looked down at the stranger, now breathing slowly in sleep. He doesn't look like a warrior, Callan said. No, Ailey agreed. But sometimes words do more damage than swords. Far off, somewhere beyond the snow-covered trees, a horn blew, low and distant. Ailey froze. Her eyes darted toward the door. That's not a hunting horn. Callan felt the air tighten around them. Someone's coming, she whispered. Suddenly the night didn't feel so quiet anymore. /**. On the ridge overlooking the village, the two riders sat still, their dark silhouettes barely visible against the snow. They had dismounted and now watched the flickering lights below. One held a small spyglass to his eye, his breath fogging the glass slightly. He's there, he said. How can you be sure? The first man lowered the spyglass. The healer's hut is dark. The boy's isn't. A pause. Shall we wait till morning? No. We go now. The longer we wait, the more time he has to talk. They turned and descended the slope in silence. /**. Back at the hut, Ailey was wrapping the stranger's wounds in fresh linen, her hands steady despite the fear rising inside her. Callan stood near the door, a wooden club in hand, the only weapon they had. We should hide him, he said. Where? Callan looked around. The hut was too small, too open. Then his eyes landed on the trapdoor under the bed, just a shallow storage space where they kept dried meats and root vegetables through winter. He might not fit, Ailey warned. We have to try. Together, they pulled the stranger across the floor, moving slowly, carefully. His body was limp but heavy. They opened the trapdoor and lowered him inside, wrapping blankets around him for warmth. When they shut the lid, they pushed the bed back into place and scattered a few items to make it look untouched. Callan wiped sweat from his brow. A knock came, not loud, just 3 quiet taps on the door. Callan and Ailey froze. Another knock, then silence. Ailey stepped forward slowly, placing a hand on Callan's shoulder. Say nothing. She opened the door crack. 2 men stood outside, dark cloaks, steely eyes, snow collecting on their shoulders. Evening, one said smoothly. May we come in? We're not well, Ailey replied. Best not risk it. The second man smiled coldly. We're not here for healing. Ailey didn't move. We're looking for someone, the first one said. A man, wounded, might have come through this way. Many wounded pass through, Ailey replied evenly. Some live, some don't. We like a check inside, just to be sure. She paused for half a beat. You'll find nothing but peat smoke and old bread. The second man stepped forward, but the first one raised a hand. We'll return, but if you see someone, tell us. It's dangerous to protect the wrong sort. He leaned in slightly. Even more dangerous not to tell. Then they turned and vanished into the snow. Ailey shut the door and bolted it tight. Callan exhaled, not realizing he'd been holding his breath. We can't stay here, Ailey said, her voice low. Where can we go? There's a croft 2 miles up the ridge. Abandoned. If we move now, we might beat the storm. She gathered supplies quickly. Her bag, herbs, a wrapped loaf of bread. Callan filled a flask and grabbed a spare cloak. They lifted the man from the trapdoor again, wrapping him in layers and placing him gently on the sled. By the time they stepped outside, the snow was up to their ankles and still falling. They didn't look back as they vanished into the trees. But behind them, in the shadows beyond the firelight, someone had been watching the whole time. And now, they knew exactly where to follow. The wind cut sharper the higher they climbed. Snowflakes stung Callan's face like pinpricks, but he kept pulling the sled, step by step, refusing to look at how far they still had to go. The croft Ailey spoke of was somewhere above the ridge, an old stone dwelling that had been abandoned years ago after a fire had blackened half its roof. Nobody lived there anymore. At least, that's what people said. But in times like this, rumors didn't matter. What mattered was shelter. Behind him, Ailey walked in silence, her boots crunching steadily behind his. Every so often, she checked the injured man, who was wrapped tightly in woolen cloaks. He hadn't woken since they left the hut. His skin was cold to the touch, but he was still breathing. Barely. Keep going, she urged softly whenever Callan slowed. Not much farther. He nodded, teeth chattering too hard to speak. The woods thinned as they reached the crest of a hill, and through the swirling snow, Callan saw it. A low, crumbling shape of gray stones, barely visible under the white. The roof sagged on one side, but the other looked solid enough. The door was gone, replaced by an old slab of timber leaning in the frame. Still, it was shelter, and that was all they needed. With one final push, they reached the door. Callan dropped the rope and bent over, gasping for breath, while Ailey pried the wood aside and stepped inside first. The air smelled of damp straw and ash, but it was dry. There was even a rusted iron stove near the far wall. Ailey moved quickly, clearing a space while Callan brought the sled inside. Together, they lifted the man onto a pile of hay, and she immediately began checking his pulse again. He's colder than he should be, she murmured. We need heat. Callan spotted some dry wood stacked in the corner. It was old, gray, and dusty, but it would burn. He gathered what he could and lit a small fire in the stove. The flames rose slowly, weak at first, then stronger, throwing flickering shadows across the walls. Ailey unwrapped the man's layers to rub his arms and legs, trying to bring warmth back to his limbs. She looked over at Callan. You did well, she said quietly. Callan didn't feel like he had. His fingers were raw, his face numb, but her words still meant something. He sat down on a stone near the fire, staring at the dancing flames, trying not to think about the 2 cloaked men at his door, or the way one of them had smiled. They'll come after us, he said. Ailey nodded. Yes, but not tonight. The storm will slow them. For now, we rest. Tomorrow, we decide what to do. Callan looked at the man again, the stranger who had brought all of this chaos with him. His chest rose and fell softly now. There was color coming back to his face. Do you think he'll live? I think he wants to, Ailey said. They fell into silence again, the fire crackling between them. Outside, the storm howled across the hills, shaking the loose stones and whistling through the cracks in the walls. The croft felt like a tiny island in a sea of snow. Alone, exposed, but alive. Callan didn't realize he'd drifted into sleep until a sound snapped him awake. Voices. Faint. Outside. He sat up, eyes wide, heart racing. Ailey was already standing, a finger to her lips. She crept to the wall and peered through a narrow gap in the stones. 2 figures moved through the snow, lanterns in hand. Not the cloaked men from before, These were villagers. Callan recognized one of them, Tam McCrae, the baker's son. The other was older, maybe a farmer. Both looked cold and cautious. "They're searching for us," Callan whispered. "Not just us," Ailey replied. "They're looking for him." As if on cue, the man stirred again, groaning softly. Ailey hurried to him and placed a hand on his forehead. "Don't speak yet," she whispered. "You're safe." He blinked slowly, eyes bloodshot but alert. "Where?" "In the hills. You were attacked." He nodded weakly. "The ledger. Is it safe?" "We don't know where it is," she said gently. "But you mentioned it." The man's eyes locked onto hers. "It cannot fall into the wrong hands." Callan stepped closer. "Who are you? Why are they after you?" The man swallowed hard. "My name is Duncan McCauley. I'm a record keeper for the High Council. I was tasked with maintaining the clan accounts, land holdings, alliances, debts, betrayals. Someone learned what I knew. They tried to kill me before I could speak." Callan frowned. "So, that ledger, it has names? Evidence?" Duncan nodded. "It could unravel half the alliances in the Highlands." Ailey's face darkened. "Which means it could start a war." He nodded again. "It's hidden. I buried it near the river. But they know I'm alive. They won't stop until they find it, or silence me forever." Callan's head spun. He was just a boy, just a shepherd's nephew. He wasn't supposed to be part of this. But now, a secret book buried in the snow could decide the fate of entire clans. And he was the only one who knew where the man who'd hidden it was. Outside, the villagers were moving past, lanterns casting orange glows through the trees. They didn't come close, but they were getting closer. Word had clearly spread. "They'll return," Ailey said. "And next time they won't knock." Callan stepped to the window and looked out. He didn't know much about power or councils or the fragile web that held the clans together. But he knew what it meant to stand at a crossroads. This was one of them. "We can't run forever," he said. "No," Duncan agreed weakly. "But we can reach someone who will listen. Someone who still believes in truth." "Who?" Callan asked. Duncan's eyes flickered. "Lady Mairead of Loch Torrin. She's one of the few with power who hasn't sold her loyalty. If we reach her, we might have a chance to stop what's coming." "And how far is Loch Torrin?" Ailey asked, already knowing the answer would not be comforting. 3 days by foot," Duncan whispered, "if the passes aren't blocked." Callan nodded slowly. "Then we leave at dawn." And so the plan was set, not because it was wise or easy, but because it was the only path left. A boy, a healer, and a half-dead record keeper, bound together by a secret that could shake the Highlands to their core. The fire crackled lower. The wind howled louder. And outside, unseen in the growing storm, more than villagers were watching the hills. Not all of them with kind eyes. Something bigger had been set in motion now, and none of them would be able to turn back. Snow fell heavier by the hour. It blanketed the hills in silence, covering footprints, hiding trails, and wrapping the world in a stillness that only made danger feel closer. Inside the ruined croft, the fire crackled low, casting flickering shadows on the stone walls. Duncan lay wrapped in thick layers, his breathing shallow but steady. Callan sat nearby, legs tucked under him, watching the flames and trying to understand how his life had changed so quickly. Just 2 days ago, he was stealing potatoes to quiet his hunger. Now he was caught in something much bigger, a hidden ledger, powerful clans, and a man who claimed to carry the truth that could split the Highlands in two. The weight of it settled heavy in his chest. He wasn't special. He wasn't strong. He was just a boy with cold hands and torn boots. Yet here he was, the only one who had stood between Duncan and death. Ailey stirred a pot over the fire. She'd found some dried barley and wild garlic tucked away in the cross pantry and managed to turn it into a thin soup. It didn't taste like much, but it was warm. She handed Callan a wooden cup and gave him a faint smile. "You've done well," she said softly. Callan stared into the cup. "I didn't do anything. You kept him alive. That matters." He looked over at Duncan, who hadn't spoken since sharing his name and the danger that followed him. There was something haunted in his face now, even as he slept. A man used to secrets. A man who had seen things he hadn't yet spoken of. Callan hesitated. "Do you believe him?" Ailey was quiet for a moment. I believe something's coming, and he's part of it. Outside, the wind groaned against the crooked roof. It wasn't just the weather. Something else moved beneath the surface of things. Whispers, tension, an unease that had settled over the land like a mist that refused to lift. The clans had always held rivalries, but for the past few months, something had shifted. More skirmishes, more guarded looks at village gatherings. People were quieter, more suspicious. A storm had been building for some time, and now it was beginning to break. Callan took a small sip of the soup. "Who is Lady Mairead?" he asked quietly. Ailey's expression changed. Not fear, exactly. Something more cautious. "She's the daughter of a chieftain from the Lochs," Ailey said. "Her father was known for keeping peace between the clans when things got tense. After he died, she kept to herself. But people say she's clever, sharp-tongued, hard to fool. Why would Duncan trust her? Because if she's anything like her father, she knows how dangerous the clans can be when the wrong men lead them." Callan stared at the flames, his thoughts racing. If what Duncan said was true, and that ledger really did hold secrets about land, money, and broken pacts, then it wasn't just Duncan's life in danger. Anyone who helped him was at risk. And if certain clans learned that book had surfaced again, they wouldn't stop at threats or questions. They'd burn everything in their path to keep it buried. Ailey turned toward the door, her eyes narrowing. "We won't be able to leave in daylight." Callan nodded. "Too many eyes. Too many people looking. And not all of them from the village," she added. "Word travels fast in the Highlands. Someone told them he was alive. Someone close." The thought sent a chill through Callan that had nothing to do with the cold. He'd grown up in the village. Everyone knew each other, shared food, traded stories. But now that sense of safety was gone. He couldn't help but wonder who had watched them, who had seen him dragging the sled through the snow, who had whispered to strangers behind closed doors. Ailey reached for her cloak and pulled it tighter around her. "We'll move at dusk tomorrow. Quietly. No fire, no trail. And if they find us—" She looked at him, her face hard. "We don't let them." Night settled in like a heavy blanket. Duncan stirred now and then, murmuring in his sleep, names and places that meant nothing to Callan. He wondered what the ledger looked like. Was it just ink and paper? Could a few pages truly cause so much trouble? He remembered the stories his father used to tell before the fever took him. Tales of old kings and betrayals, of battles fought not just with swords, but with lies and secrets. Back then, they were just bedtime tales. Now they felt like warnings. In the morning, the world was still white, but the wind had eased. Ailey stepped outside first, scanning the hills. No movement, no tracks, but their own, already half covered. She returned inside and set about preparing supplies for their journey. Bandages, herbs, a few handfuls of oats, and the last of the clean water. Callan watched Duncan slowly open his eyes. The man looked stronger today, though still pale. "You stayed," he said quietly. Callan nodded. "We couldn't leave you." Duncan tried to sit up, winced, and lay back down. "Thank you." There was a long pause. "They won't stop," he said at last. "The clans that want that ledger buried, they have reach. Influence. Not just warriors. They have spies. Loyalists. People you'd never suspect." "Then we go to Lady Mairead," Ailey said. "You said she'd listen." "She might," Duncan replied. "But we'll need proof. If we make it to the river, I can lead you to where I buried it." Callan looked at Ailey. "If we go down toward the river, we're heading straight into the open. We'll move through the old deer trails," she said. "They're slow but covered. If we avoid the roads, we might reach the river unseen." Duncan closed his eyes. "Once we have the ledger, we'll have leverage. Until then, we're just fugitives." Outside, the clouds shifted, casting a strange, pale light over the hills. The Highlands looked beautiful in the snow, quiet, endless. But Callan no longer trusted the quiet. He knew it could be shattered at any moment. He sat by the fire, sharpening a broken piece of iron into a crude blade. He didn't know how to fight, but he was learning how to survive. That, for now, would have to be enough. And just beyond the hills, unseen from the croft, a figure on horseback watched the ridge through a spyglass, waiting for the first sign of movement, waiting for the next step in a game that had only just begun. The rain hadn't stopped in days. Cold, heavy sheets of water soaked the countryside, turning dirt roads into slushy traps and making daily life even more miserable for those barely scraping by. Inside the wooden walls of a damp croft, Elspeth stirred a pot of oats over a fire that hissed and cracked beneath a dripping ceiling. Her hands were rough, knuckles swollen from the cold and constant labor. The smell of damp wool hung in the air, mixing with the earthy scent of peat smoke. She kept her eyes down, but her ears were alert. Something had shifted in the village these past few weeks, though no one dared speak of it plainly. It started with the cattle. First, 2 from Widow Mary's field had turned up dead, their bellies bloated, eyes glassy, no clear cause. Then, a few days later, a boy had vanished from a neighboring village. The monks said it was wolves. The Lord's men said it was thieves. But the whispers in the fields told a different story, one too old and frightening for most to voice aloud. Elspeth heard them, though. Every time she walked through the glen or passed the stone ring on the hill, she felt it, that prickling in the air, the sense of being watched by something ancient. Her husband, Aidan, was out hunting, though food had become scarce. Even rabbits seemed to have vanished into the hills. Elspeth's stomach twisted with more than hunger. She hadn't seen Aidan in 2 days, and that wasn't like him. He was no nobleman's lackey. He was strong, quiet, and careful. He didn't take risks unless he had to, and when he did, he always returned. But now silence. No footprints in the frost. No smoke signal from the forest. Just absence. Outside, the wind pushed through the trees with a low moan. At the edge of the croft, the family's old dog growled softly, its ears perked toward the woods. Elspeth dropped her spoon, wiped her hands on her apron, and stepped to the doorway, squinting through the rain. Something was coming down the road. It was a figure, slow, limping. Not Aidan, not any villager she recognized. As it got closer, she saw the mud covering its legs, the torn cloth that clung to its shoulders, and the hollow look in its eyes. The figure collapsed at her doorstep. "Help!" the man rasped. "They're awake." Elspeth knelt beside him, but he was already unconscious. She dragged him inside with what strength she had, laid him near the fire, and covered him with a woolen blanket. His body was ice cold. There were deep scratches on his arms and back, and the smell of something old, wet moss, iron, and rot, clung to him. She sat back on her heels, heart thudding. He wasn't from their village, but his brooch marked him as a scout from Lord Dunrith's keep 3 valleys over. What was he doing here, and what had he seen? As she watched the man's chest rise and fall, she couldn't shake the words he'd whispered. "They're awake." The days grew shorter. The sun barely rose before retreating behind thick clouds. At night, strange noises crept through the thatch, and even the livestock refused to leave their pens. A soft humming had begun in the air, a vibration that didn't come from the wind or trees. Elspeth wasn't the only one who noticed. At the village meeting, the blacksmith's apprentice mentioned hearing voices on the edge of the forest, soft, urgent voices that vanished the moment he turned around. No one laughed. No one scolded him for fantasy. They were all feeling it now. Something was returning to the land. Something they had long forgotten or maybe tried to forget. 2 nights after the injured scout arrived, Elspeth sat with him again. He had barely eaten, barely spoken. When he finally opened his eyes, his voice was hoarse and trembling. "I went north with 2 others," he said, staring into the fire. "We followed smoke near the old cairns, up by the standing stones. Nothing should burn up there. It's cursed ground. But the Lord said to go. He said there'd been signs. Offerings." Elspeth's fingers gripped her knees. "What did you find?" The man blinked slowly. "We found bones. Not just animal. Human. Arranged like some kind of warning. Circles. Marks carved into stone I'd never seen. My friend, Angus, he touched one of them. Said it was humming like it was alive. Then he screamed. The scout looked down at his hands, his voice barely a whisper now. He started tearing at his own face. Blood ran from his nose. He kept saying a name, but I didn't understand it. Then he just stopped. Elspeth's breath caught in her throat. And the others? Gone. Something pulled them into the woods. I ran. I ran for miles. I don't know how I got here. She glanced outside again. The rain had eased, but the wind still blew hard through the trees. That name, the one the man couldn't understand, she wondered if she'd heard it too, once. Long ago, when her grandmother warned her never to walk the moors alone. Not after dark, not when the heather was in bloom. She looked at the fire. You said they're awake. What do you mean? The scout's eyes met hers, wide with fear. The old ones, the ones before the clans, before the monks, the ones the hills remember. They're waking up. Elspeth didn't sleep that night, nor did half the village. Somewhere in the dark, a horn blew, low and far off. It wasn't the kind their men used. It was older, deeper, and it shook the ground underfoot. The next morning, a group of villagers rode to the edge of the northern hills to investigate. They never came back. No sign of a fight. No bodies. Just their horses, returned alone, eyes wild with terror, flanks streaked with foam and mud. That was when the elders called a meeting beneath the ancient yew tree, the same place where generations had once gathered to mark seasons, births, and deaths. The priest was there, but he stood silent. It was the midwife, old Morag, who finally spoke. I've seen the signs, she said, voice steady. The earth is remembering. They say the ground never forgets, and they're right. What we buried is rising. A hush fell over the crowd. Elspeth stood among them, arms wrapped around herself, the weight of dread heavy on her shoulders. She thought of Aiden, still missing. She thought of the scout's words. She thought of the stone ring on the hill. And she remembered what her grandmother used to say in a whisper when the wind howled just like this. The land takes what it's owed, child. Always. Now, standing in the crowd, Elspeth realized those words had not been a warning. They had been a prophecy. The village would not survive what was coming. Not as it was. And she wasn't sure if any of them truly understood what they'd woken. Not yet. But they would. The wind cut harder now, carrying the scent of peat and distant fire. The Highlands seemed quiet, but it wasn't peace. It was the kind of silence that presses against your chest, warning you to tread softly. Meadow pushed forward, boots sinking into the damp earth, eyes scanning the horizon. Behind him, Elspeth walked carefully, clutching the small leather pouch that held dried herbs and a few precious drops of honey. She'd offered to carry more, but Meadow refused. Whatever happened up north near the burned crofts, he wanted her hands free, her legs unburdened. He didn't say why aloud, but she understood. You didn't carry weight on a road that might demand you run. They stopped just after midday by a ruined church, stone walls crumbling inward, only the arch of the doorframe still standing like a broken tooth. Crows stirred inside, lifting noisily into the air as Meadow stepped across the threshold. Bones of an old altar lay beneath moss. The roof had long since fallen in. Elspeth rested beside a toppled gravestone, brushing dirt from the name etched there. She didn't read it. She just touched it gently, then pulled out the cloth-wrapped bread. "Do you think they're still alive?" she asked. Meadow looked toward the north again. Some of them might be, if they got out fast enough. She didn't ask who he meant. Everyone had lost someone. The Highland clearances weren't yet happening in force, but rumors swept across the country like early frost. Villages abandoned. Families pushed into the sea. Fires started not by raiders, but by landowners wanting pasture for sheep instead of people. Still, what happened in Kelderak wasn't just a matter of landlords. Something else had crept in. Meadow had seen the patterns before. Livestock slaughtered with no meat taken, children vanishing before dawn, even stone walls split without explanation. Superstition? Perhaps. But too many people whispered the same thing. It's the old ways, stirring again. After they ate, they kept moving. The trail bent through a grove of birch trees, then up a ridge where the sky widened and the air sharpened. From there, they could see the black streaks left by fire crawling up the slope beyond. That's where Kelderak had been. The village was smaller than they remembered. Ash had swallowed it. A few wooden frames still stood, charred but upright. The longhouse at the center had collapsed inward, its roof beams melted down to twisted cinders. Meadow walked slowly among the wreckage, boots crunching over brittle remains of thatch and burned clay. No signs of life, no voices, just wind. Then he heard it, a small, wet cough. He motioned sharply for Elspeth to stay back and followed the sound, stepping carefully toward what had once been a weaver's cottage. The door had burned away, but the stone hearth still stood. Inside, curled in the shadow like a fox cub, was a boy, barefoot, soot-covered, and no older than 7. His eyes tracked Meadow, but he didn't run. Meadow knelt beside him. "Are you hurt?" The boy didn't speak. He just stared. Elspeth approached slowly, her presence soft, her hands open. She pulled a flask of water from her pouch and offered it. The boy drank, one small sip at a time, not spilling a drop. When she asked his name, he shook his head. "No, just not ready." "Is anyone else alive?" Meadow asked. The boy's eyes drifted toward the trees beyond the last cottage. He said only one word. "Them." That night, they camped in a hollow near the river, far from the burnt-out village. Meadow set no fire. Even the boy understood why. Elspeth made tea with the herbs she'd carried and gave the boy small sips until his trembling eased. He didn't sleep. Neither did they. Around midnight, they heard the scream. It didn't come from the woods. It came from the stone. A low, grinding cry like something ancient waking up, full of teeth and grief. Meadow stood quickly, hand to his blade, eyes scanning the darkness. The boy buried his face in Elspeth's cloak. There were stories passed down in Old Gaelic, things older than the churches, older even than the Picts. Creatures that didn't hunt for food, but for memory, for fear, for something only the living could give. The scream was followed by silence, then soft humming that never resolved into a tune, just the echo of a lullaby from no human mouth. The next morning, Elspeth found markings in the dirt, spirals and jagged lines drawn in ash. No footprints, just shapes. The boy pointed to them, then to the woods. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. By the time they reached the northern glen, the air had shifted. Everything smelled like wet stone and iron. The trees were thinner here, but they leaned in close, their branches like reaching fingers. The boy began walking ahead now, as if guided by memory. They passed a standing stone at the edge of the glen, tall, with runes carved so deep they seemed to bleed shadow. Elspeth brushed her fingers across it. "Cold. I've seen this before," she whispered. "In the old books. But it's not supposed to be here." Meadow didn't speak. His focus was on the small stone hut just beyond the clearing. Its roof was intact. Smoke curled gently from its chimney. Someone still lived there. They approached with caution. Meadow knocked once, then again. The door creaked open on its own. Inside, a woman stood at the hearth. Her hair was long, silver white, and braided down her back. She looked up without surprise. "You brought him," she said, her voice dry as old parchment. Meadow stepped inside slowly. "Do you know him?" The woman's eyes didn't blink. "He was born for what should never have returned. You should not have brought him here." The boy clutched Elspeth's cloak tighter, but she didn't step back. "He was alone. You think we should have left him to die." The woman turned back to the hearth. "Some things do not die. They wait." Meadow looked around. The hut was clean. No dust, no clutter. Herbs hung from the ceiling in neat rows, each labeled with runes. A book lay open on the table, its pages stiff and ancient. He couldn't read the language, but the drawings chilled him. Figures with no faces, villages burning, a great mouth in the earth. "What happened in Keldarak?" he asked. The woman stirred something in the pot, then answered softly. They called it back. "By accident, or out of hunger, I do not know. But once a threshold opens, it doesn't close easily." Elspeth looked down at the boy. "And him. He came through it," the woman said. "But he did not cause it. He is what's left." The boy lifted his head then, looking not at the woman, but at the stone behind her hearth. Something was etched there too, an older marking half hidden in soot. Elspeth stepped closer to look. A spiral, wide and curling inward like a funnel. Meadow's hand drifted again to his blade. "Are we safe here?" "No," the woman said. "But nowhere is. Not now." A heavy silence fell. Outside, the trees shifted again, bending slightly toward the hut. Not with the wind. There was no wind. Then came the sound, footsteps where there should have been none. Slow, deliberate, circling the glen. The boy stepped back from the window, his lips moving silently. Elspeth leaned in listening. He was praying, not to the Christian God, not in Latin, but in something older, something she didn't understand. And in that moment, she knew this boy wasn't just a survivor. He was part of the reason the world had changed. Meadow met Elspeth's eyes. Whatever they had walked into wasn't over. Not even close. The night dragged on, heavy with silence broken only by the wind as it whispered through cracks in the stone walls of the crofts. Isla lay awake, staring at the low timber ceiling, her hands folded over her chest. Every groan of the old wood sounded like a footstep. Every shift in the wind was a voice too low to understand. The mystery that hung in the air didn't let her rest. Not just the voices her grandmother had mentioned, but the disappearance of that small boy from a village over the ridge, the odd behavior of Father Amon, the sudden silence in the woods that had once been full of birdsong. Something was off, and she could feel it in her bones. Her father, Callan, had said little about the raid that was feared from the north, only that they were to stay ready. But his hands, blistered from sharpening iron tools late into the evening, told Isla more than his words ever could. Everyone feared the coastal raiders. Some were Norse remnants, others were rival clans. But lately it wasn't just about them. It was about something deeper, stranger, more unsettling. The livestock had been skittish. The dogs wouldn't go near the old well. And the last time Isla had ventured near the ruined abbey on the hillside, she'd seen fresh boot prints in the mud, far too large to belong to any villager. Isla had always been curious, but never reckless. And yet now, she found herself more drawn than ever to the edges of what was safe. That evening, she decided to follow the noise she'd heard again near the standing stones. She'd waited until her parents had fallen asleep, then wrapped herself in her heavy wool cloak and crept out. The forest looked different at night. Trees that had once seemed familiar now loomed like twisted shadows, their bare branches scratching the sky. She moved slowly, keeping her steps light, not wanting to startle whatever might be out there. Her breath turned white in the cold air. Then, just as she reached the edge of the clearing, she stopped. Voices, but not speaking. Chanting. Isla crouched low, her heart pounding. There were figures gathered near the stones, 6, maybe 7. Cloaked. They moved in a slow circle, some holding torches, others bowing their heads. She couldn't make out their faces, but the low, rhythmic hum they sang chilled her deeper than the night wind. It wasn't Gaelic. It wasn't Latin either. It was something else, something older. She thought of the stories her grandmother had told, of the old faith, of those who once whispered to the land before the monks came. She thought they were just that, stories. But now, watching from the shadows, she wasn't so sure. Then, one of the figures turned. Isla ducked low, barely daring to breathe. Had they seen her? She waited. A long minute passed. Then 2. Finally, the chanting stopped, and the group began to disperse silently into the woods, as if swallowed by the dark itself. She waited until she was sure they were gone, then stepped slowly into the clearing. The ground near the stones was warm. A circle of scorched earth remained, faint but clear. Whatever fire they'd used had left no wood behind, only a charred ring in the grass. In the center lay a bundle wrapped in cloth. Isla leaned in and gently unfolded the corner. It was a crude wooden carving of a face. Not human. Its features were distorted, eyes bulging, mouth stretched in a twisted grin. She dropped it and backed away. Her stomach churned. Something wasn't right. Something dangerous was being hidden in the hills, and no one was talking about it. The next morning, she tried to speak to her grandmother. Have you ever heard of people gathering at the stones? Not for prayers. Something older. The old woman paused her weaving, then set it down with a sigh. I warned you, Isla. I told you there are things best left alone. Then you do know something. I know there are paths you walk that don't lead back. Her words left Isla more uneasy than before. Later, when she asked her father about the old abbey, he said it was sealed off for a reason. Monks left it when things turned. That hill's cursed. Has been since before I was born. But Isla remembered the prints. The half-burned candles near the broken altar. Someone had been there recently. More than once. Across the region, more strange stories began to surface. A shepherd from another glen claimed to have seen a fire light up the sky and vanish in an instant. A woman from the Lochside village whispered that the stars over the mountain had begun to move, not just twinkle, but glide across the heavens like wandering eyes. No one spoke of these things during the day, but at night, with their doors locked and their fires burning low, they whispered. That winter grew colder than any the village elders could remember. Frost came early. The rivers froze. Food ran scarce. And with the cold came silence. Few dared to walk the woods. Livestock vanished without a trace. Once, a group of boys went to hunt rabbits and returned white as snow, refusing to speak a word of what they saw. Isla noticed Father Eamon more and more often near the old paths. Not preaching, just watching, listening. She asked him once why he'd taken to the woods. Some sins, he said slowly, don't die with the men who commit them. They live on in places, in silence, in stone. His eyes were hollow that day. One evening, a traveler arrived. A thin man wrapped in dark robes, face shadowed by a hood. He came from the south, bearing no sigil, carrying a single book wrapped in oilskin. He asked no questions, paid in coin older than any Isla had seen, and stayed in the tavern without speaking to anyone for 2 days. On the third morning, he was gone. But so was one of the villagers, a girl Isla had known since childhood. Her name was Mora, and no one dared to ask where she'd gone. The village leaders insisted she'd gone to serve a noble's house down near Stirling. But Isla found the lie too neat, too clean. Mora would have told her if she were leaving. They'd spoken just days before, and Mora had mentioned something that now chilled Isla to the core. She'd said, I dream of that face, the one in the wood carving. You saw it too, didn't you? Isla had never told her. Not a word. Now, more than ever, she felt alone. The weight of whatever was happening pressed on her chest like stone. She wanted to believe it was just imagination, just folklore creeping into her waking hours. But too many things added up. Too many eyes turned away when they should have looked closer. She returned to the standing stones one last time before the snow came. This time, there was a new symbol etched into one of the stones, a spiral within a triangle, and at its base, a fresh smear of blood. Not animal, human. And this time, she wasn't alone. Someone was standing at the edge of the clearing, half shadowed by a tree. Watching her, the figure didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. Isla froze, her breath caught in her throat. Then the figure raised one hand and pointed to the hills beyond the abbey ruins. And just like that, it vanished. Isla didn't run. She couldn't. Her legs refused to move, because something deep in her knew the worst had yet to come. The air in the glen had turned colder, and not just because of the creeping winter. Every villager could feel it, a kind of unease that sank into their bones and whispered that something was coming. It wasn't just the fear of starvation or the brutal tax collectors. It was something else, something older. Word had started to spread from the coastal towns that ships had been spotted. Not merchant ships. These were darker, longer, moving silently with sails low like ghosts sliding across the sea. Raiders. Again, Roari, now 17, stood near the fire in the longhouse, sharpening a blade that had seen too many winters. He had once imagined himself as a blacksmith or maybe a hunter like his uncle, but times had changed. Now, every boy his age was expected to know how to fight. Not in an army, not with training, but with desperation. His younger sister, Isla, sat near their mother, helping her boil oats. The family dog whimpered in the corner, sensing the thick tension hanging in the air. Outside, the chief's messenger was riding hard down the path, yelling the same message at each door. Prepare, all able-bodied to the stone's circle by nightfall. There was no confusion. This wasn't a meeting to trade sheep or argue over fields. This was war, or at least the closest thing their village had ever seen. While Ruari strapped on his belt and kissed his mother's forehead, his mind flashed to something strange he'd seen days earlier. Deep in the woods, on one of his hunting runs, he'd stumbled across an old cave. It wasn't unusual to find shelter like that scattered through the hills, but this one had markings. Symbols carved into the stone that didn't belong to any clan he knew. And inside, bones, perfectly arranged in a circle around a dark pit. He hadn't told anyone. Not yet. At the stone circle, men gathered, all carrying what little they had: rusted swords, wooden spears, pitchforks sharpened into points. Old warriors with graying beards stood shoulder to shoulder with boys who had never tasted real combat. The chief, Domnall, stood tall on a rock at the center. He was a man whose face told the story of every season he'd endured: wind-burned cheeks, a nose long broken, and eyes that had seen too many friends buried. "We don't know when they'll strike," he said, his voice low but clear. "But the tide's changing. They never used to come this far inland." "What do they want from us?" one woman cried out. "They don't come for sheep anymore," Domnall replied. "They come because we're weak. Because the South is bleeding and no one's left to guard the North." His words landed hard. England was still locked in its own troubles: civil war, famine, political chaos. No help would come from there. And the kings of Scotland? They sat far off, behind castle walls, dealing with their own rivalries and wars of succession. The Highlands were on their own. As the meeting broke up, Ruari slipped away and made his way toward the glen. Something inside him was pulling him toward that cave again. Not out of bravery, but curiosity. Fear, too. But he needed to understand what he'd seen. If there was something darker happening, something beyond just raiders and hunger, he had to know. He walked the path as dusk settled, the trees casting long shadows like arms reaching out to grab him. When he reached the cave, he paused. The wind had gone still. Not quiet still, as if the forest had stopped breathing. The opening was there, dark and waiting, and the markings were just as he remembered. But this time they glowed faintly. Not bright, just enough to make him blink. He stepped inside. His boots crunched lightly on gravel, and the air was cold in a way that didn't match the outside. Cold like the dead. He reached the center, where the bones had been, and found them disturbed. Moved, but not by animals. Carefully, intentionally shifted. A few of them now pointed outward, forming strange lines like arrows. In the center, where the pit had been, was now a circle of ash. Fresh ash. Someone had been here. A voice behind him nearly stopped his heart. "You saw it too, didn't you?" Ruari turned. It was Catriona, the miller's daughter. He hadn't even heard her approach. She looked different, less like the shy girl he remembered, and more like someone who'd been carrying secrets. "What are you doing here?" he whispered. "The same as you," she answered, trying to understand what's waking up. Catriona stepped forward and pulled something from her satchel. A piece of parchment, old and brittle, with markings that matched the stones outside. "This came from my grandfather's things. He used to warn me about this place. Said it was built long before our clans even came here. Said there were people who lived in these hills who worshipped things that weren't gods." Ruari stared at the paper, then back at the pit. "Why now?" She shook her head. "Because something's been disturbed. I think it's the raiders. They're not just here to steal. They're looking for something." Ruari felt a chill crawl up his back. "You mean they're after this?" Catriona nodded. "Or worse, they already have it." Back in the village, a fire was building in the sky. A scout ran in from the west, shouting that the next village was burning. And the attackers? They left no bodies. Just silence. The villagers were gone. Domnall ordered torches lit and the village barricaded. But nothing felt safe anymore. That night, while most tried to sleep, Ruari couldn't. He kept hearing whispers, not from people, but from the woods. The wind carried voices, none he could understand. When he closed his eyes, he saw the cave, the ash, and something rising from the pit. Something without a face. In the distance, a horn sounded. Not one of theirs. Low, deep, and unlike anything they'd ever heard. The real enemy had arrived, but no one knew yet what it truly was. The summer rains came early that year, turning the dirt paths into thick, sucking mud. Cattle trudged through it with tired eyes, and villagers had to lift their skirts or kilts high to avoid being splattered. The weight of the season pressed down not just on the land, but on the people too. Food was scarce, tempers short, and rumors thick in the air. Some said the forest had grown restless. Others whispered about missing travelers and strange lights flickering beyond the hills at night. Fear in those days didn't have to shout to be heard. It whispered from every corner of the glen. Young Callum McCrae sat outside the longhouse, sharpening a wooden spearhead with a jagged stone. He wasn't old enough to fight in raids, but he had watched his older brothers go off more than once, returning bruised and hollow-eyed, or worse, not at all. His hands moved nervously over the shaft of the spear, not because he expected battle, but because he knew one was coming. Not with another clan this time, but something darker, something no blade could truly stop. Inside the longhouse, his mother Morag stirred a pot of barley broth, muttering under her breath about the thinning grains and the merchant who hadn't shown up from Stirling. She remembered a time when summers brought laughter and harvest festivals. Now, they only brought hunger and uncertainty. The chieftain, Domhnall, had once promised protection, but even his warriors were beginning to look over their shoulders. A chieftain could handle feuds, not omens. Around the village, a strange unease had settled like fog. It was in the way people avoided eye contact, how they whispered just out of earshot. Even the healer, old Maigred, had taken to keeping her door locked and her herbs packed tightly in little cloth bundles. She claimed she had seen something near the standing stones, something tall and robed, something that had no face, only a voice that didn't come from its mouth. Most brushed her story off as madness or the result of too much heather wine, but deep down, none dared go near the stones after dusk. One evening, the blacksmith, a burly man named Owen with a temper like a hammer strike, returned home to find his forge door open. Tools scattered, coals gone cold. His apprentice, Ruarid, had vanished. No one had seen him since sunrise. The boy had no family, just a cot near the bellows and a mangy dog that wouldn't stop howling. Owen searched the fields and the riverbanks, even the shallow caves where boys sometimes dared each other to sleep for a night. Nothing. No footprints, no cries, only silence. That silence spread. Some villagers began to speak of the gloam. Not quite night, not quite day. A space between times when the world slipped sideways and let other things in. It wasn't part of the church's teachings, nor did the old druids, still alive, dare name it. But it was real in the way a cold wind down your neck is real. Several claimed they saw flickers in the gloam, shapes darting between trees, whispers curling through the heather. They began placing charms on their doors and hanging bundles of rowan and salt from their windows, hoping old customs might still hold power. Eldred, the priest, tried to quell their fears with sermons. He spoke of divine tests and warned against the old ways. But fewer people attended his Sunday gatherings. His words rang hollow against what their eyes had seen. Even he had begun to carry a blade beneath his robes, and he never walked alone. A man of God, yes, but a man first. Up the ridge, nestled close to the edge of the forest, lived an old woman known only as Finna. She had lived alone for longer than most could remember, and her cottage was said to be older than the village itself. Children dared each other to touch her gate, but no one crossed it. It was said she had once been married to a laird who vanished during a thunderstorm and that she hadn't aged a day since. Some thought she was a witch, others a seer. But one thing was certain, she knew more than she ever let on. One afternoon, as the sun hung low and pale in the sky, Domhnall himself rode to her gate. He didn't knock, only waited. After what felt like an hour, the door creaked open. Finna stepped out, her gray hair woven into a single long braid, her eyes clear and sharp. They didn't speak much, not in front of the men who had escorted him. But when Domhnall returned, his face was drained of all color. That night, he summoned the village elders. They met in secret in the roundhouse near the center of the village. Candles flickered along the edges, casting strange shadows on the walls. What was said that night didn't reach the villagers directly. But by morning, there were new patrols. Boys barely old enough to grow beards were handed spears and told to guard the paths. Women began gathering herbs from Maigred more frequently. And the baker, usually full of jokes and songs, stopped singing altogether. Callan noticed it too. The air felt heavy, like the village was holding its breath. His sister Isla, always bright and curious, had become quiet. She clutched a small pouch of wildflowers at all times, though she never said why. One evening, She told Callan she had dreamed of a man with no eyes, standing in the middle of the barley field. She said he called her name, not with a mouth, but from the inside of her own head. Callan didn't laugh. He just stared at the field until the moon rose. The next day, more cattle were found dead. No wounds, just wide eyes and mouths frozen open. The healers said it was poison. The blacksmith swore it was fear. The chieftain ordered a prayer circle. None of it seemed to matter. Whatever was creeping in from the woods didn't fear iron, prayer, or reason. And it was getting closer. Despite the rising tension, life continued in fragments. Bread still needed baking. Water still needed fetching. But everyone moved faster now, glanced behind more often. The forest was no longer a place of hunting and gathering, but something to be feared. Trees once familiar seemed to lean in strange ways. Birds sang less. Dogs barked more. And then, just before the summer solstice, it happened again. Two young men, cousins from the far side of the glen, set off to gather firewood near the river. They never returned. By the time a search party found their tracks, they led to the riverbank and simply stopped. No blood, no sign of a struggle. Just stopped, like they had vanished mid-step. At the village council, panic began to bubble beneath the surface. The elders argued. Some wanted to leave and travel south to bigger towns with stone walls. Others insisted they stay, protect what was theirs, fight if needed. Finna's name came up again. So did words like curse, pact, and forgotten oaths. But none dared say those things too loud. You could feel it, like the air itself was listening. The only one who seemed unfazed was Finna. She remained in her cottage, sometimes walking the edge of the forest at twilight, barefoot, her arms open like she was speaking to something no one else could see. Some said she was trying to protect them. Others thought she was calling closer. Callan, curious and afraid, began to follow her from a distance. Not close enough to be seen, just close enough to observe. He never heard her speak, but he did notice something strange. Wherever she walked, the wind followed her. Trees bent ever so slightly. Birds stilled their wings. It was as if the land recognized her. One night, unable to sleep, he wandered past the cattle pen and stood on the ridge overlooking the glen. Below, the village lights flickered like stars on the ground. Then just beyond the trees, he saw it, a flicker of movement. Not a person, not an animal, something slower, intentional, a shadow that moved against the moonlight, not with it. His heart raced, but he couldn't look away. The gloam had returned, and it had brought something with it. The air hung heavy over the village as dusk crept in, painting the Scottish sky in streaks of smoky gray and cold orange. Somewhere in the hills, a lone wolf howled, its voice echoing through the valley and bouncing off the damp stone walls of Glenbrae. People had always said the wolf was a sign of danger, of loss, or of something coming. The old folk whispered about omens, and tonight, even the skeptical glanced toward the hills more than once. Nobody dared speak of what really weighed on them, the fear that this winter might break more than just bones. Callan sat on a wooden bench outside his family's croft, sharpening his father's old dagger. The edge was chipped and the handle wrapped in worn leather, but it had saved lives before. He didn't know if it would again, but he kept sharpening it, more for the ritual than anything else. Across the dirt road, smoke curled from the blacksmith's hut. Inside, Brock was hammering late, his face lit by orange sparks, trying to finish the iron nails the laird had ordered. The laird wanted stronger fences around his lands, not to keep animals in, but to keep people out. Word had spread fast after the last raid. A dozen riders in dark cloaks had slipped through the hills at night. They left behind a burned grain shed and 2 missing children. People blamed everyone. English raiders, rival clans, or even the strange pilgrims who had passed through just weeks before. But deep down, most villagers knew this wasn't just a random attack. There was something behind it, something planned. The kind of fear that didn't speak its name, but it showed up in quiet glances, in how doors were locked before sunset, and how even the bravest didn't walk alone anymore. Mary, the healer's daughter, had been watching from the shadows. She always did. Her hands were stained with herbs, but her eyes held secrets. She wasn't like the other village girls. While they dreamed of warm beds and safe husbands, Mary dreamed of truths. Of the old stories her mother whispered, about witches who walked under the moonlight and kings who died with curses on their tongues. She had found strange runes carved into the bark of a birch tree near the loch last week. No one else had noticed, but Mary had felt it in her bones. Something was being summoned. At the edge of the village, the church bell rang. Not the slow toll of Sunday prayer, but a quick, sharp ring. A signal. Something had been seen near the eastern woods. Men grabbed spears, even if half the tips were rusted. Young boys clutched torches, hiding how their hands trembled. And older women watched from behind cracked shutters, whispering prayers to saints whose names they barely remembered. Callan stood too, sliding the dagger into his belt and locking eyes with Brock across the road. No words passed between them. There didn't need to be any. The eastern woods had always been avoided after nightfall. The old stories told of spirits trapped between worlds, of whispers in the dark, and of lights that led men away, never to return. But now they had no choice. The village council had agreed. They couldn't lose more grain, and they couldn't let the raiders get closer. So they marched, slowly, carefully, each step a gamble. The path to the woods was muddy and slick, but the footprints they followed were clear. Fresh, heavy, not one pair, but many, too many. Callan knelt beside one of the prints, running his fingers through the soft dirt. The boot was wide and deep. Military, maybe, not local. He looked up at Mary, who had followed them quietly. Her eyes said what no one dared speak. These weren't just thieves. These were trained men. Soldiers. But from where? And why Glenbrae? There was nothing here but cattle, barley, and cold winds. Deeper into the woods, the air turned colder. The trees grew thick, their limbs nodding overhead like clenched hands. The group moved slower now. Every sound seemed louder. The snap of a twig, the hoot of an owl, the crunch of boots against frost-covered roots. Then they found it. A clearing. A fire long since burned out. Ashes still warm. Bones too. Not animal. Human. Small. Children. Someone let out a gasp before covering their mouth. Mary moved forward first, kneeling near the blackened circle. "These aren't just remains," she whispered, her voice shaking. "They've been arranged." Indeed, the bones weren't scattered. They were set in a pattern, almost like a wheel. Symbols had been carved into the surrounding stones. Old symbols. One's not taught in church. Callan stepped back, bile rising in his throat. It wasn't just a raid. It was a ritual. But for what? They heard the horn then, distant, deep, like thunder wrapped in metal. Not one of theirs. A warning from the other side of the forest. Or a signal. Panic spread fast. Brock grabbed Callan's shoulder. "We have to go. Now." But Mary stayed frozen, her eyes fixed on one of the symbols. "This one," she said slowly, "this means sacrifice." Before anyone could speak, the forest exploded with noise. Not weapons yet, but movement. Many feet. Crashing branches. Dogs? No, not dogs. Heavier. Closer. The villagers turned and ran, stumbling through mud, arms outstretched in the dark. The forest was no longer just trees and shadows. It was alive, and it was hunting them. Callan stayed close to Mary, pulling her forward. But she didn't want to run. She wanted to understand. And that made her dangerous. When they finally broke through the trees, breathless and bleeding, Glenbrae looked different. Torches burned. Not theirs. Fires in the distance. Smoke rising. The village wasn't safe anymore. And standing at the far ridge, lit by firelight, were the riders. Not bandits. Not English. Clad in strange armor and bearing a flag no one recognized. Black, with a silver stag and a red slash through the neck. Behind them, shadows moved, men, or something else. They didn't speak. They just watched, then turned back into the dark. Glenbrae had been warned. But warned of what? No one could answer. Not yet. Callan's father used to say, "There are two Scotlands. The one we live in and the one that lives under our feet." Maybe now both were waking. And maybe this time, neither would let the other survive. The mist rolled heavier now, slipping in from the hills like a slow-moving ghost, swallowing trees, paths, and thoughts with equal silence. Mary's bare feet padded along the dirt path behind the abbey, the cold seeping through the soles into her bones. She hadn't told anyone she was going, just left the small crofter's cottage before the others woke. The letter, if one could call it that, was tucked tightly in her linen pouch, the edges still damp from the morning dew. She didn't know if she believed the words, but something in them stirred a memory. A voice she hadn't heard in years. A warning, perhaps. Behind her, the village stirred slowly. Chickens squawked. Wood cracked against stone as hearths were stoked to life. And yet something hung in the air, heavier than mist. Something was about to change. Mary ducked beneath the low stone archway near the chapel ruins, her fingers brushing over old carvings that had long since faded. The stones whispered secrets, like they always did when she came alone. No one else could hear them. She was sure of that. It wasn't madness. It was something else. A knowing passed down like scars from mothers to daughters. Across the moor, Dougal crouched by the peat trench, his fingers digging through thick roots, lifting earth with practiced motion. But his mind wasn't in the labor. It was on the old man they'd buried last week. The one found near the riverbank, arms crossed wrong, mouth open like he'd been trying to speak one final word. Father Aidan said it was the fever, and maybe it was, but Dougal had seen the marks. Thin, sharp slices on the forearms, dried blood under the nails. Not from sickness, from something worse, something that still walked free. He rose, wiping dirt on his tunic, and stared toward the western woods. That's where the sounds had come from. Low humming, metal against stone. Once even laughter, strange and hollow. No one believed him, of course. They said he needed rest, or ale, or both. But he knew what he'd heard. Meanwhile, in the northern edge of the settlement, near the broken standing stones where no one farmed anymore, a boy named Callum sat under the old ash tree, clutching the black feather he'd found. It was too large to be a raven's. It shimmered oddly, like oil in water. He didn't tell his mother. She already scolded him for bringing home the broken amulet last week, the one carved with spiral patterns and strange runes. She said it was cursed, and maybe it was. Since then, their cow refused to give milk, and the firewood snapped and smoked no matter how dry it seemed. Callum's eyes darted up as a branch cracked nearby. He saw no one. Still, the feather twitched in his hand like it was breathing. Back in the village square, the laird's steward, an aging man with a weather-beaten face and eyes that missed nothing, paced slowly across the cobbles. He watched the people from under his hood, calculating. There were whispers in the halls about taxes rising again. The King's War in the South drained more than coin. It took men, horses, grain. And always, the poorest paid most. He'd seen it before, and it never ended well. At the edge of the crowd, young Elspeth sold roots and dried berries from a woven basket, her voice soft but steady. Behind her, her grandmother sat on a low stool, skin like parchment, eyes milky and still. No one remembered when the old woman last spoke, but children often said she whispered at night in a language no one knew. Elspeth didn't believe the stories until she woke one morning to find her basket rearranged in symbols. Circles of rowan bark, knots of heather twine, shapes that looked like shields or eyes. And then came the rider. No one saw him arrive. One moment the road was empty, the next he was there, his cloak a deep, tattered blue, his face shadowed beneath a heavy cowl. The horse he rode was massive, black as pitch, and oddly silent. Its hooves left no mark in the damp soil. The rider didn't speak. He simply dismounted and handed a sealed scroll to the steward before vanishing into the mist the same way he'd come. The scroll bore a wax seal no one recognized, a thorny branch wrapped around a sword's hilt. The steward didn't open it right away. He waited, like a man weighing the weight of his breath. That night, the council gathered inside the hall. Lanterns hissed and spat, casting light on aged timber and bowed heads. The scroll was opened. The words inside were not in the king's hand, nor the bishop's. They were older, signed not with a name, but with a mark, a spiral with a broken arrow through it. It says the oath is broken, the steward muttered, his voice shaking slightly. It says the balance is owed. No one knew what it meant. Not fully. But the oldest among them, a shepherd woman with no teeth and a laugh like wind through trees, began to cry. And somewhere, beneath the ruined chapel where Mary stood, something moved behind the stones. The next morning, the sheep would not graze. The birds stayed silent, and the black feather was gone. The fear didn't come all at once. It crept in slowly, like rot under floorboards. Doors were barred tighter. Eyes watched the forest longer. Even the priest began to stammer in his sermons, speaking half in Latin, half in something older. In her dreams, Mary saw the moors burning, not with fire, but with shadow. Figures walked the hills, cloaked in shapes that changed as she watched them. One bore her father's voice, another her brother's smile, but none of them were truly human. She woke choking on her breath, clawing at her own skin. She told no one, but the next morning she left bread and salt by the chapel wall, just in case. By week's end, another villager had vanished. A tanner named Fergus, strong as an ox. His tools were left in the open, his fire still smoldering. No sign of a struggle. Just gone. In the tavern, men whispered theories. Wolves. Spirits. Rebellion. One drunk claimed it was the English testing magic. Another said it was the old gods, angry at being forgotten. But no one laughed when he said it. Not even the barkeep, who usually laughed too loud. Dougal began keeping his father's old blade with him again, hidden under his coat. Not because he expected a fight, but because something in him knew. Something was waking. Something older than lords or kings or coin. Mary returned to the spot behind the chapel each morning now. Not to pray, but to listen. The stones no longer whispered. They hummed. And one morning, she found a symbol carved into the moss. A spiral, broken down the middle. A mark she'd seen before. In a letter. On a scroll. In her dreams. And beside it, pressed into the earth, a footprint too long to be human. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She just whispered a name she hadn't spoken in years. Then turned to find Dougal standing behind her, face pale, eyes wide. And the first thing he said was, "They've crossed the river." The mist hadn't lifted for days, and Ewan McKinnon's boots were soaked through with cold peat water. He pushed uphill, step after step, through the uneven terrain of the Highlands, chasing the memory of a scream that still rang in his ears. Somewhere in the valley behind him, the last remnants of his village were smoldering under a light drizzle. Fires didn't last long in this part of medieval Scotland, not unless someone fed them, and no one was left to do that. He paused on a ridge, his chest heaving. There, across the moor, a line of torches moved steadily like snakes slithering through the fog. The MacDougals. The scent of their destruction still clung to the wind. Charred wood, blood, and something worse Ewan didn't want to name. They hadn't come just to plunder. They came to erase. Highland clan conflicts weren't about territory anymore. They were about pride, revenge, and memory. Ewan had no weapons except a short knife and the determination that had kept him alive for 21 brutal winters. He crouched behind a thorn bush and watched the procession. His mind raced. Not for vengeance, not yet, but for answers. Why his village? Why now? He thought of Moira, his younger sister, who'd been taken as the fighting broke out. He had seen her face, terrified, reaching toward him as the invaders pulled her away. That was the moment that changed everything. The fire inside him hadn't stopped burning since. Further north, in a wind-swept tower house nestled among the crags, the MacDougall chieftain, Fergus, pored over old maps and letters. One letter bore a wax seal that Ewan would have recognized if he'd ever had the education to read. It was marked with a royal crest. The King of Scotland, if such a title truly held weight in these wild parts, had quietly made promises to the MacDougalls, just as he had to the Stuarts and the Campbells. Promises of land and favor in exchange for support in a growing political struggle. The wars with England might seem far away to most villagers, but up in these high valleys, they were the cause behind every raid, every burned croft, and every missing girl. The people of medieval Scotland didn't need parchment to feel the weight of power games. They felt it in their stomachs. In the sudden silence of a winter night when cattle disappeared. In the tightening of border patrols, the random appearance of strangers in the glen, or the priest whispering Latin prayers at odd hours. Ewan had grown up with these signs, but never truly understood them, until now. Meanwhile, Mora had not forgotten the feel of home. She sat inside a tent far from any village, her wrists raw from the rope that had been tied too tight for too long. She wasn't alone. There were others like her, taken during various raids, some from different clans, others who spoke with Lowland accents. Mora knew better than to cry. Tears made you look weak. Weakness got you noticed, and getting noticed here meant danger. One woman, older and missing several teeth, leaned close to her as they sat by the fire one night and whispered, "They're moving us to Dunbray. That's where they keep the ones who don't return." Mora didn't ask what that meant. She didn't want to know. Back near the coast, a monk named Brother Aidan was scratching notes into his vellum scrolls. He was one of the few who still tried to document the truth of medieval Scotland, even if no one wanted to read it. He wrote about the famine that had swept through the Isles the winter before, about how crops failed not just from weather, but from constant trampling armies. He wrote about the growing unrest among clans, and how justice had become a word with no meaning. And though he didn't know Ewan or Moira, he wrote of them in spirit, of nameless souls caught in battles they never chose. Aidan had once served in a monastery that stood at the edge of a glen near where Ewan's village once lay. He remembered the children with bare feet in the snow, trading eggs for salted meat. He remembered Ewan's mother, always silent, always watching the hills like she expected bad news to arrive on horseback. Maybe she had known something before anyone else. Back in the wilderness, Ewan made camp with nothing but heather and old instincts. He'd been tracking the McDougall path for days now, moving like a shadow, surviving on roots, berries, and sheer will. He avoided towns, too dangerous. He avoided other travelers, too unpredictable. But what he couldn't avoid was the growing sense that something larger was moving beneath all of this. His sister's kidnapping was part of something deeper. And yet, no matter how far he walked, he kept hearing the same story whispered. The clans are changing. The king wants more, and those who don't bend will break. In the taverns where whispers floated more freely than ale, rumors swirled of an ancient manuscript stolen from an abbey, a map, perhaps, or a prophecy that foretold the rise of one clan above all others. The McDougalls were said to have it, and some said they believed Moira held the key to understanding it. That's why they hadn't harmed her yet. But even whispers carried dangers. In one such tavern, a young blacksmith who had briefly known Ewan spoke too loudly of the McKinnon boy seeking his sister. By morning, the smith was found unconscious and his shop burned to the ground. No one asked questions. That was the way of things. Somewhere beyond the ridge, an old woman named Sorka stirred a bubbling pot over an open flame. Her hut was lined with bones, charms, and dried herbs. People called her a healer, a witch, a seer. It depended who was asking. She remembered Ewan as a child, stubborn and quiet. She also remembered the last time a McKinnon had gone looking for revenge. It had not ended well. But Sorka had seen signs, unsettling omens in her dreams, blood on her doorstep without cause, crows circling over water. She muttered to herself as she worked, "Something's coming. The land is stirring." The forests of medieval Scotland were thick, dark, and teeming with more than just animals. Stories told of those who vanished into them, swallowed by time or magic or worse. Ewan knew the tales, but didn't fear them. He feared only failure now. His body ached, but his purpose kept him upright. As he neared a half-ruined chapel hidden among the trees, he saw something strange. Footprints, small ones, barefoot and recent. Not soldier boots, not raiders, possibly prisoners. He followed them cautiously, heart pounding louder with every step. Then he saw it, etched onto a mossy stone wall, just barely visible under lichen. A mark he recognized. His sisters. When they were children, they used to scratch symbols on trees to guide one another during their games. It was their secret, and now it meant one thing. She was alive, and she wanted him to follow. But as he knelt to study it, the sudden snap of a branch behind him made him freeze. He turned slowly, his hand inching toward his knife, But what he saw wasn't a raider. It was a boy, no older than 10, covered in mud and wearing scraps of plaid too big for him. His eyes were wild, and he didn't speak, just pointed toward the woods, then disappeared into them like a ghost. Ewan hesitated for only a moment before rising and following the path where the boy had pointed. The tension in his chest grew with every step. The trees closed in tighter. The air got colder. Something waited on the other side. But what? He didn't know yet. Only that this was no longer just about his sister. And turning back was no longer an option. The night air clung to the stone walls of the small village, thick with mist and the bitter smoke of peat fires. Life in medieval Scotland had always been unforgiving, but lately the weight pressing down on the people felt heavier. Rumors spread faster than the wind that whipped through the glens, of raids, of betrayals, and of a truth buried so deep it could break the clans apart. Young Ewan stood in the shadows of the kirk, his breath shaky. He was just a boy by most standards, barely 16 summers, but his eyes carried the worry of a man 3 times his age. He held a woolen pouch close to his chest, the contents still warm, oatcakes and a sliver of salted mutton, stolen from the village hall. Not for himself, for someone he should have reported. Someone the elders had warned was cursed. Behind the kirk, past the low wall covered in lichen and vines, lay the caves. Ewan made his way down the slope quietly, mindful of the soft mud beneath his worn boots. Every sound echoed here, a snapped twig, a shift in the wind, and the caves had a reputation of their own. People said ghosts of those who died during the famine years still wandered the darkness, angry and hungry. Ewan wasn't afraid of ghosts. He was afraid of being wrong, afraid that helping Isla, the healer's daughter, would bring ruin upon his family. Isla had been missing for nearly a moon now. Everyone believed she had fled after the last sickness took her mother. But Ewan had seen her, thin, trembling, and hiding in those caves, whispering about something she wasn't supposed to know, something that made her dangerous. "You shouldn't have come," Isla said as Ewan slipped through the narrow entrance, her voice barely above a breath. "You're still coughing," he said quietly, handing her the food. "You've lost more weight." Isla ignored the food for a moment and stared at him, her eyes dark in the torchlight. "They'll kill me if they find me. Not for what I did, but for what I know." Ewan felt the words catch in his throat. "What do you know?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her sack and pulled out a strip of cloth, blood-stained, torn at the edges, but clearly part of a noble's tunic. "It belonged to Sir Alastair," she whispered. "I found it by the loch, the one they said he drowned in." "That was 2 years ago," Ewan said. "You think it was murder?" "I think he found something that was never meant to be known. I think someone made sure he never spoke again." Ewan didn't ask how she knew. Isla had always listened more than others, heard the drunken mutterings in the inn, the priest's half-spoken regrets, and the secrets mothers told their children when they thought no one else was near. "You can't stay here forever," he said after a long silence. "They'll come looking." "I'm not staying," she said, standing now, her figure outlined against the flickering light. "I'm going to the stronghold. I need someone to listen, someone who can stop them." "You mean the king's men?" Ewan asked, his voice rising in disbelief. "They won't listen to a girl. And if they do, they'll hang you just to quiet the story." Isla looked at him, not with fear, but something more determined. "Then I'll find someone who will. This land, it's not just cold and harsh. It's twisted by power. People suffer and starve not just because of the weather or war, but because of choices made behind thick stone walls." Back in the village, unease was spreading like frost. Old Morag, the weaver, had been found dead in her hut, eyes open, mouth frozen mid-scream. No signs of struggle, no wounds. The priest declared a sign, a warning. He said the gods were restless, angered by the hidden sins of the people. The villagers whispered of curses, of old magic, and of a girl who vanished with herbs and secrets. But Duncan, the blacksmith, knew better. He remembered the last time fear had gripped their village like this. It was years ago, after a failed harvest. A boy had vanished then too, and weeks later, they found him at the bottom of a well, his mouth stuffed with heather. Everyone had said it was punishment, divine, just necessary. But Duncan had never believed it. Now, he watched the village elders gather again behind closed doors. He saw the same look in their eyes, calculation, not grief, not concern. And late one night, when he followed them out past the fields to the edge of the forest, he saw them burying something that looked far too large to be just supplies or tools. He didn't speak of it, not yet, but the memory burned into his mind like the forge's flame. Elsewhere in the glen, near the burned remains of a once great watchtower, a different kind of fire was building. Moira, the widow of a soldier who never returned, had begun to speak to others in hushed tones. About unity, about standing up to the old ways, about asking why they must always suffer in silence. "You're stirring trouble," warned her brother, a shepherd who feared the wrath of the laird. "They'll call you a witch." Moira shrugged. "Let them. Truth sounds like heresy when you're used to lies." The story spread, that a girl had escaped the caves, that the dead whispered in dreams, that the noble clans had been hiding something for decades, something tied to the disappearances, the hunger, the fear. And far up in the stone towers of Glenwyn Keep, Laird Malcolm listened with a clenched jaw as his steward reported whispers from the towns below. His land had been growing restless for years, but now it felt different, personal, as if a single thread had come loose in the great tapestry of their rule, and someone was pulling at it. He turned to the darkened corner of the hall, where an older man stood watching, a monk with a scarred face and eyes too sharp to be just religious. "If the girl reaches the capital, it's over," the laird muttered. "She won't," the monk replied, already moving toward the door. "I trained her mother. I know how she thinks." Laird Malcolm said nothing more, but in the firelight, his expression darkened. This land, this legacy, had been built on silence, and silence would be preserved at any cost. Back near the riverbanks, Ewan was helping Isla saddle a thin, stubborn pony. She refused to take the road, knowing it would be watched. Her path would wind through forests and across mountains. Dangerous terrain, but maybe safer than the eyes waiting along the king's roads. "You should go back," she told Ewan one last time. But Ewan shook his head. "You'll need someone to speak for you, to prove you're not just a mad girl running from ghosts." She didn't smile, but something softened in her face. They rode out just before dawn, the mist thick as wool, their silhouettes swallowed quickly by the ancient trees. Behind them, in the quiet stillness of a sleeping village, something shifted. A dog began to bark in the distance. A door creaked open, and near the kirk, a shadow moved, not toward the caves, but toward the trail the pony left behind in the dew-covered grass. The chase had already begun. Would they reach the capital? Would Isla's truth ever see daylight? Or would the silence of medieval Scotland swallow them whole, just as it had so many others? That answer still waited in the dark. Ask ChatGPT. By the time the days grew shorter and the wind howled louder across the glens, the land around the village of Invertosh seemed more alive with tension than ever. Duncan could feel it in the way people spoke, shorter, sharper, with less warmth and fewer words. Even old men who once sat outside the church mumbling about oats or the weather now stayed indoors, clutching rosary beads or sharpening old blades they hadn't touched since youth. The quiet fear was growing, and it spread like frost through stone walls. Father Brogan had returned from the monastery, his face pale and his eyes sunken. He didn't speak of what he'd seen on the road back, only warned the villagers in hushed tones to be cautious and stay near family after dark. He'd brought news of another village, south of the mountains, where 3 families vanished overnight. Their hearts were cold, animals left untethered. No signs of fire, battle, or theft. Just gone, and no one dared to follow their trail. Duncan tried to focus on helping his uncle in the forge, but even there his thoughts wandered. The blackened iron hissed when it hit water, steam rising like smoke from old pagan altars. There was something ancient in the air lately, something older than Christian fear. It was in the trees, in the moaning wind, in the way the birds had stopped singing in the woods. A traveling merchant arrived one morning, dragging a wagon missing its rear wheel. He looked half-starved and claimed he hadn't eaten since he crossed the bridge at Loch Eileen. He spoke of bandits who weren't bandits. Men without faces, wrapped in torn gray cloth, standing motionless along the roadside like stone idols. His horse refused to move past them. He'd abandoned the road, took a path through the Highland hills, and never looked back. The villagers exchanged uneasy glances. Duncan noticed how Father Brogan clenched his jaw when the story was told, then left early without a word. Later that evening, Duncan joined Isla and Fergus near the riverbank. The cold stream still bubbled with life, but the forest beyond it felt still and heavy. Isla stared out at the trees, her fingers tightening around her wool cloak. "You remember the legend of the Hollow Glen?" she whispered. Fergus scoffed. "That's just a story for scaring children." But Isla didn't laugh. "My grandmother told me when I was little. The glen that breathes. People who walk through it hear their names whispered by the trees. Some return without memory. Others don't return at all. She said it was cursed ground, long before the priests came. Long before we called this land Scotland." Duncan didn't say anything. He had heard that tale too, though never spoken aloud since his mother passed. And now, hearing it again, it felt less like a story and more like something knocking quietly at the back of his mind. They went back before sunset, but even as he walked the village path, Duncan felt as though something watched from the tree line. Not eyes, but a presence, indifferent, heavy, and vast. That night, a scream woke the village. Everyone rushed from their homes with torches, shouting and calling names. Smoke and fear clouded the air. A barn had collapsed. The wood splintered from within as if something large had burst through it. The livestock were gone. Every sheep and cow vanished without blood or sign of struggle. Just broken beams and muddy prints leading north toward the hills. Fergus's father examined the tracks, and his face paled as he stood. "They're too wide for any man, but too narrow for a beast." No one spoke after that. As the days went on, the strange incidents grew more frequent. More stories from passing monks. More travelers with eyes sunken and voices hollow. A hunter named Eden returned from the northern woods with his hand burned and shaking, muttering about shadow wolves. Large, silent creatures with eyes like silver coins that vanished when touched by torchlight. No one laughed anymore, not even Fergus. The village held a meeting, and Father Brogan urged everyone to remain united. "Fear isolates the soul," he said. "If we turn on one another, the darkness wins." But even he looked unsure now. Duncan noticed the priest began carving old Celtic symbols into his doorframe, something he never would have done before. It wasn't just prayer he relied on now. It was older protection, the kind whispered about only when the moon was full and the fire burned low. One morning, Duncan woke to find Isla gone. Her family had no idea where she went. Her cloak remained folded near the hearth, and her boots were still beside the door. There were no signs of struggle, only the faintest trail of bare footprints leading to the woods. No one could explain why she would have left in the middle of the night. Duncan refused to believe she'd simply run away. He searched for days, even as the villagers warned him not to stray too far. The forest, once a place he knew every tree and stone, now felt unfamiliar. The deeper he walked, the quieter it became. No birds, no wind, just the soft sound of his boots pressing into damp earth. He reached the edge of the hollow glen without realizing it. A circle of withered trees, their trunks split and gray, surrounded a dark, sunken path. The air felt wrong, too still, too cold. He took one step forward before something inside him screamed to turn back. His breath caught in his chest. It wasn't fear. It was memory, something long forgotten, like a whisper from childhood returning in a sudden wave. He stumbled backward, heart racing. A voice, low and dry like crackling bark, seemed to murmur his name. He ran, not stopping until the village walls came into view. But Isla was still gone. Fergus, silent for once, offered him a flask of water and sat beside him near the well. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Something was happening, and they were part of it now. That night, someone knocked on Duncan's door. He opened it expecting his uncle, but found no one. Just a small object on the ground, a charm made from braided hair and bone, bound in leather and etched with strange symbols. It pulsed faintly with warmth, as though it had a heartbeat of its own. He picked it up and felt something stir in the back of his mind. Not a voice, but a memory that didn't belong to him. A face in a mist, a fire in a stone circle, and a scream that echoed for centuries. He dropped it and stepped back, but he already knew what it meant. Isla had left for a reason, and something wanted him to follow. The village was still when the wind stopped. Not a soul stirred, not even the dogs barked. It was as though the land itself held its breath. In the distance, dark clouds loomed over the highland peaks, curling low into the glens like silent watchers. The tension that had gripped the villagers for weeks now crept into every breath, every whisper, every cautious footstep. Duncan stood near the edge of the forest, staring into the trees. He had followed strange hoofprints there, prints far too deep for any Highland pony, and headed where no local rider dared go. The cattle thefts were no longer isolated. Just 3 days prior, the McInnes clan had lost 10 head, all taken in a single night. That same evening, one of their oldest shepherds vanished without a trace. There was talk that the raiders came from across the sea, perhaps Norsemen returning or a hidden faction of mercenaries. But others feared something older, something from before the clans, before the lairds, before written record. Isla heard the whispers in the women's circle. They spoke while spinning wool, hiding their words behind gestures and glances. The stone circle was lit again, someone had said, on the full moon. That place was older than anything built with reason. Locals didn't go there after sundown. Not even the wild animals went near it. Some believed the ancient stones could curse a man. Others thought it was a gate. But for now, Isla kept her head down. Her hands moved over strips of flax, weaving them tight, her eyes only lifting when someone passed by. The market had thinned. Traders no longer lingered in the village, choosing safer lowland routes instead. What little food was harvested now came from private stores, hoarded behind locked doors. Even a local priest no longer held mass in the open. He'd quietly moved his services indoors, always finishing before dusk. Alastair, the young boy with the wild red hair, had taken to wandering off into the hills. His mother was frantic, constantly looking for him, fearing he'd wander too far or too deep into the woods. One evening, Duncan found the boy kneeling at the edge of a dried-up stream, drawing strange patterns in the dirt with a sharpened stick. When asked where he learned the symbols, Alastair simply said, "They told me." He wouldn't say who they were. The conflict that had begun as scattered raids was now something else entirely. Fear didn't just rise from what was taken, it rose from what was left behind. At one burned homestead, they found a pile of feathers arranged in a perfect circle around a broken spear. At another, every window was shattered outward, as if something had burst from within. People weren't just running. They were disappearing without any fight. No blood, no signs of struggle, just silence and absence. Malcolm, a former warrior who had fought against the English years before, now wore a constant scowl. He gathered the able-bodied men one evening at the Long Hall. The firelight made his expression look carved from stone. "We're being watched," he told them. "Not by soldiers, by something else, something patient." He advised them to sleep in shifts and sharpen every blade they had, even the kitchen knives. "Keep a dog by your door," he added, "and if the wind changes at night, don't follow it." Meanwhile, Isla found herself drawn to the ancient manuscripts hidden in the chapel's back room. Father Callum had once told her to stay away from the older texts. "They're not God's work," he said. But now, when he wasn't looking, she lit a candle and flipped through the pages. One text, bound in leather and sealed with wax, mentioned a shadowed winter from long ago, when darkness lingered for weeks and the stars vanished. The story was written in a dialect even she struggled to decipher, but she recognized a few symbols, ones Alastair had drawn. Back in the woods, Duncan pushed deeper along the trail. The hoofprints were now joined by bare human feet, small, narrow, and sunken. He crouched to examine them when the air around him shifted. Not a breeze, but a subtle change in pressure. The trees, once whispering with wind, now stood still and breathless. Then, from behind him, a crack, a branch snapping under weight. Duncan spun around, blade drawn, but no one was there. That night, Isla was awoken by a low humming sound outside her window. It wasn't singing, but it had a rhythm, almost like chanting carried on the wind. She tiptoed to the window and looked out. In the distance, where the fields met the trees, she saw faint lights, blue and green, dancing like fireflies, but too synchronized, too intentional. The lights moved in a pattern, forming a slow spiral, then vanished all at once. The next morning, news arrived that old Greer's farm had been abandoned. Not burned, not looted, just empty. The door was left wide open, the stew pot still warm, and all the chickens still in their coop. But no sign of Greer or his sons. The sheepdog was tied up out front, barking at nothing. Tensions rose fast. The laird's messenger came from the castle, warning the villagers not to speak of what they'd seen. He said it would draw attention the crown didn't want. The message was clear. Silence was survival. But the villagers had seen too much, heard too much. They knew that the raids weren't about gold or land anymore. Something was being sought, something hidden, something old. One night, Isla found a last there kneeling in front of the chapel. He wasn't praying. He was whispering into the stone steps. When she gently called to him, he turned, eyes wide and glassy. "They're almost here," he said. "They want the door opened." Isla froze. "What door?" "The one below," he answered, "where the earth hums." By now, even Father Callum looked shaken. He asked Isla to read the rest of the old manuscript with him. Together, they discovered references to a sealed cavern beneath the glen, a place where druids once performed forbidden rites. The text warned of voices that could lure children and dreams that could unearth memories not your own. At the very end, a line was scratched in deeper ink, almost torn into the page. "When the breath of stone returns, the sky will bow and the veil will thin." Malcolm began organizing a group to ride out to the ancient circle. "If this is the heart of it, we end it there," he declared. But even as he spoke, his hand trembled. He wasn't sure what they'd find or what might be waiting. The night before they left, Isla dreamed of walking barefoot through ash. Around her, the trees wept blood. And in the distance, beneath the stars, a tall figure waited with outstretched hands, not to welcome, but to claim. And just before she woke, she heard the boy's voice whisper in her ear, "The stones remember." The wind changed again that night, sweeping low through the glens like a whisper that didn't want to be heard. In a darkened croft, young Ewan turned over in his straw-filled bed, staring at the flickering shadows the fire cast on the timbered ceiling. Something had shifted, not just in the air, but in the people. The unease was spreading like damp through stone. Even the animals were quieter lately, as though they too were waiting for something. The silence of the sheep, the stillness of the birds. Ewan's mother said the land could sense when trouble was coming. And trouble had many faces in medieval Scotland. Whispers of a second band of raiders had reached their village. This time, not English, but Highlanders from deeper north, stirred by feuds older than memory. Clan fights were nothing new, but these weren't just warriors looking for cattle or coin. These men were said to come with their faces painted black, riding without sound, their blades curved like sickles. No honor, no warning, just smoke in the sky and silence afterward. Their name was barely spoken aloud. The Soror Dub or the Black Twist. No one knew what they wanted, only that they were getting closer. As the villagers gathered at the kirk, faces pale and voices hushed, Father Tomas urged calm. But his words, though steady, trembled underneath. His own hands shook as he clutched the carved wooden cross at his chest. "Steel your hearts," he said. "We have seen worse winters. We've outlived plague and lords. If we stand as one, we will survive this too." But standing together only helped if there were enough people left to stand. And slowly, one by one, families started slipping away at dawn. No announcements, just empty crofts and flattened grass where carts had rolled into the hills. Fear was growing faster than the barley. Ewan's father, Robert, had no intention of fleeing. "If we leave," he said, "we give them everything, and they'll just follow. They always follow." But even he looked smaller lately, more tired. The lines around his eyes had deepened, and he flinched more at every distant howl of wind. His left hand never left the axe hanging from his belt. A farmer's axe, not a warrior's. But it would have to do. Then came the letter, or what passed for one. A torn strip of deer hide, smeared with dark ink, possibly blood, and pinned to their village door with a blackened iron nail. No name, just a message burned into the leather with fire-hardened lines. 3 nights, then fire. No one claimed it. No one saw who left it. But by the next morning, 3 more families had vanished. And those who remained knew this was no hollow threat. That night, the second twist came, not from raiders, but from within. Ewan caught sight of his uncle Alastair, usually the first to defend the village, speaking in secret with 2 strangers beyond the fence line. Ewan hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but the moon had been full, and his curiosity stronger than his caution. He crouched behind the chicken hutch, heart thudding, straining to hear. "We keep our word," the taller stranger said, his accent thick with the northern bite of the high glens. "But the boy must come with us." Alastair was shaking his head, hands raised. "He's only a child. He doesn't know anything yet." "That's not our concern," the other replied flatly. "You promised a guide who knew the paths, someone who could reach the stone cairn without being followed. If not him, then your wife. But someone pays the debt." Ewan's breath caught. The words didn't make sense, but the tone did. It was cold, final, transactional. He backed away, barely remembering to breathe. His own uncle? Planning to hand him over? Why? And to whom? He didn't tell anyone what he saw. Not yet, because by dawn, something far worse had arrived. A figure stood at the far end of the village road. Alone, motionless, cloaked in long, gray wool, face hidden beneath a heavy hood. They didn't knock, didn't speak, just waited, as if the village would come to them. And eventually someone did. Robert stepped forward, hand on the axe, voice low. "You from Sir Dub?" No answer, just silence, followed by a slow lifting of the head. Beneath the hood was not a warrior's face, but that of a woman. Mid-aged, weathered, eyes dull, but alert like a crow's. "I've come for the cairn," she said softly. "The blood in your boy's veins leads to it." Robert stiffened. Ewan, who'd run to his father's side, looked up confused. "What's she talking about?" he whispered. Robert didn't answer. The woman went on. "You think this is about land and cattle. But the conflict runs deeper than old feuds. He's been marked. His path winds older than this village. The COR only follow what they're sent to retrieve. Now panic spread like wildfire. Marked? For what? Why his son?" Ewan's mother, Mary, pulled him close, whispering prayers in Gaelic as though they could form a wall. But deep down, she knew, whatever this was, it had begun long before Ewan's birth. The stories her grandmother used to tell suddenly echoed louder. Of ancient stones that hummed in the wind. Of bloodlines cursed to guide shadows. Of boys who vanished before their 12th summer. Ewan was 12 that very week. Robert tried to bar the woman from entering, but she simply turned and walked away. Not leaving, just waiting. She sat on a fallen tree outside the village edge, as if time itself would answer her call. That night, Ewan couldn't sleep. The words kept repeating, "He's been marked." He turned to his mother. "Why me?" She hesitated, then said, "Your grandfather was born in the high glens, near the cairn of sighs. It's where the mist never clears. He left that place to escape the curse, but some things don't fade with distance. Some things sleep in the blood. Is that where the cairn is?" She nodded. "They say those stones were placed before the clans, before the church, before anything. And they remember what walks through them." Outside, a wolf howled, but it sounded wrong. Not animal. Almost human. The next morning, Ewan was gone. No tracks. No signs. Just his cloak left folded neatly at the foot of his bed, and a single crow, feather resting on top. Robert's roar of anguish could be heard for miles. Mary fell silent, pale as ash. And Alastair? He was already gone by then. The villagers stood in stunned silence. Who took the boy? Why hadn't the watch seen anything? And was it too late to chase them? Then someone noticed something scrawled on the hearthstone. Lines drawn in ash and coal, forming a map. A twisted path leading northward into the mists, toward the cairn of sighs. And beside it, the same crow feather. Someone had marked the trail, but whether it led to salvation or something much worse, no one could say. Robert clenched his axe. Mary lifted the boy's cloak, holding it to her face. And deep in the forest, hidden in fog and stone, the second twist waited, ancient and unblinking, for the blood to return home. The rain didn't let up that evening, and the fog seemed thicker than it had been in weeks. Duncan stood near the edge of the loch, watching the black surface ripple gently with the wind. Behind him, the voices from the great hall of Kilduff Castle rose and fell like the tide. Men drinking, talking about politics they could barely influence, women whispering about marriages, debts, and disappearances. He didn't belong in there. He wasn't born with a noble title or an inheritance. But he carried something else, rumors. Lately, travelers heading south spoke of villages where people had vanished. Not during raids or wars. Those were almost expected, but quietly without a sound, with food still cooking over fires, beds still warm. Entire households gone. Duncan had heard such stories before, but this time something felt different. The latest village that disappeared wasn't far, less than a day's ride, and there were no signs of a fight. No signs of a fire, just empty homes and bloodless silence. Back inside the hall, Ewan McBain, a Highland lord with a sharp voice and even sharper nose for trouble, leaned closer to Father Colm, the village priest. The two had never gotten along. Land disputes and an argument about tithes had poisoned their relations long ago. But Ewan wasn't talking about land now. "There's something you're not telling us," Ewan said, his voice just under a whisper. "The people are scared, Colm. Your silence helps no one." Colm took a long breath. "If I speak, they'll call it superstition." "They already do," Ewan muttered. "But I've seen strong men leave in the night and never return. Children waking up screaming about a man in a wolfskin cloak. You think I'm afraid of superstition? I'm afraid of not knowing." The priest hesitated. He wasn't young anymore, and he'd served in these hills since his beard had first gone gray. He'd seen strange things, rituals buried in the roots of old trees, stories hidden under ancient stones, names that were better left unsaid. And for years, he'd said nothing. But now people were disappearing faster than he could bless their empty homes. "There's an old belief," Colm finally said, "older than the church, older than these castles. The Highlands were once ruled by clans who didn't believe in saints or crosses. They worshipped nature, spirits, beasts. There was one legend of a man cursed to walk forever between worlds. Not dead, not truly living. They called him the Hollow Hunter." Ewan scoffed, but his eyes didn't leave the priest's face. "And you think he's returned?" "I think we're not alone out there," Colm said, voice low. "And someone or something is using the old paths, the ones that don't show up on any map." That night, Duncan didn't sleep. He wandered past the northern edge of the woods, following trails barely visible in the moonlight. Every now and then, he'd stop and listen. The air was thick and too quiet. No owls, no wind in the leaves, just the soft crunch of earth beneath his boots. When he reached the old stone well near the abandoned croft, he found something he didn't expect: fresh footprints. And not just one set, 3, maybe 4. One small, childlike. The others heavy, boots caked in clay that didn't match the local soil. Then something odd caught his eye. A single white ribbon tied to the branch of a dying tree. It fluttered like a flag, clean, as if untouched by weather. He moved closer and found symbols carved into the bark just beneath it. Circles, eyes, something like a sun. But they weren't English. They weren't Gaelic either. He didn't recognize them. And that's when the air changed. He turned suddenly. He couldn't explain why, but a figure was standing where he'd just walked. Too tall to be someone from the village, too still to be natural. Wrapped in a thick fur cloak, hood shadowing the face. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but Duncan felt every part of his body tighten. He backed away slowly, hand moving to the dagger at his belt. When he blinked, the figure was gone. He ran, not back to the castle, but south, toward the woods, ignoring the branches that scratched his arms and the sharp stones beneath his boots. Whatever that thing was, it had been watching, waiting. The next morning, news spread fast. A farmer's family just 3 miles from a village had vanished. Again, no fire, no blood. Just a house with food on the table and chairs knocked over like someone had left in a rush. Duncan tried to speak to the elders about what he saw, but they brushed him off. They called it stress, bad dreams, the effect of too many sleepless nights. But one man listened, Gregor MacCrae. Gregor was no stranger to mystery. He was older than most, had lost his entire clan in a border skirmish years ago, and now wandered from one Highland town to another, offering trade, stories, and silent protection. His left I was missing, and the right one seemed to see too much. What you saw, Gregor said quietly, was real. There's something moving through the ancient hills. Something that's been sleeping a long time. But what is it? Duncan asked. I don't know, Gregor said. But I've heard the whispers. There's a cairn deep in the forest. Old, hidden. No one's been near it for a century. That's where the trails lead. If you're brave, or stupid, you'll go see for yourself. Duncan looked back toward the castle. The people there still danced, laughed, argued, lived like nothing was happening. But out here, the truth was cold and alive. Whatever was taking people, whatever had been carved into that tree, it was only beginning. Back inside Kilduff Castle, the young noblewoman Ailsa began to notice strange things in the scrolls her late father had kept locked away. Letters from abbots warning of dark gatherings, references to forgotten gods, diagrams that matched the same markings Duncan had found in the woods. She didn't know what it all meant yet, but one name kept appearing, Corvinac. She read it aloud once, and the candle by her desk sputtered. The shadows on the stone walls stretched long and strange. For a brief second, she thought she saw someone standing in the doorway. But when she turned, it was empty. The story wasn't about missing villagers anymore. It was about something deeper, older, something coming back. And it wasn't just in the woods anymore. It was inside the walls of Kilduff. Inside the scrolls. Inside the minds of those who dared to look too closely. Duncan had made his choice. He'd head toward the cairn. But he wasn't going alone. Not this time. The storm that had rolled in earlier that night hadn't passed. It had only grown heavier. Wind screamed through the cracks in stone walls, and rain battered the rooftops of Glenmore like fists pounding to be let in. Inside the long hall of the chieftain's keep, the fire roared against the cold. Faces flickered in orange light, gathered in hushed conversation, and all eyes occasionally glanced toward the door. No one could sleep. Not now. Lena sat quietly near the fire, her fingers still wrapped around the soaked edge of her shawl. She hadn't changed since returning with the news. Gregor was alive. Barely. He had been found bloodied in the ravine, close to the edge of the river. They said he kept repeating one name through cracked lips, Blaine, over and over, until he lost consciousness again. It wasn't just the wounds on his body. Something had rattled him deeper than the bruises. Something he'd seen. Ewan paced across the stone floor. Every now and then, he muttered half-thoughts, trying to piece things together out loud, like speaking might help the truth rise up from the noise. The others listened, but no one interrupted. They were waiting for him to say what they all feared. Blaine knew the old tracks, Ewan said, more to himself than anyone else. He wouldn't have needed torches to find the way. And if Gregor was ambushed, no wolf leaves cuts like that. Across the room, old Ailey shook her head. We knew something wasn't right when he left the village so sudden. Now the forest spits him back out, and we're left guessing whether this was betrayal or just survival. The room went quiet again. Outside, the gates groaned open. 2 guards rushed in, soaked from head to toe, carrying torches that sputtered against the rain. He's here, one of them said. Blaine's come back. They didn't wait for permission. The doors flung open behind them, and there stood Blaine, half-drenched, face streaked with mud, eyes hollow. He didn't look like a man returning from a journey. He looked like he'd come from a grave. He carried nothing. No blade. No pack. Just silence. He stepped forward, slow and calm, scanning the room like someone waking from a nightmare. "Where's Gregor?" he asked, voice hoarse. Lena stood. "Why do you care?" Blaine didn't answer. He turned to Ewan instead. "We need to talk." "Not here." "No," Ewan replied, crossing the room in 3 strides. You're going to talk now." The air in the hall grew still, like the storm outside had paused to listen. "I followed them," Blaine said, finally. "The ones behind the markings. I thought I could learn something before they knew I was there." "And you told no one?" Ewan snapped. "I couldn't risk them running. They're not just raiders, Ewan. They're part of something bigger. Organized. Someone's guiding them." Blaine's voice trembled, but he held his ground. "They're not just coming for our cattle or tools. They're collecting names. They were looking for someone from Glenmore." Lena stepped forward. "Who?" Blaine looked her straight in the eye. "You." The word fell like stone into still water. Lena's face twisted in confusion, then shock. "That's not possible." "They mentioned your mother," Blaine said. "They said she had something that was never meant to leave the Abbey. A text. A map." Ailey stood now, her face pale. "That map was burned with the Abbey." "No," Blaine said. "They believe it survived. They think your mother passed it to someone who would one day understand it. And they think that person is Lena." Ewan ran a hand over his beard, trying to ground himself. "Why didn't you come back with this earlier?" "Because I barely got out alive," Blaine said. "They saw me. They chased me for days. And when I lost them, I turned around. I wanted to draw them away from the village. That's when Gregor found me. He thought I was one of them. I tried to explain, but he panicked. I didn't mean to hurt him, but he slipped down the ravine in the struggle." The hall was still again. Everyone looked to Lena. She shook her head slowly, as if trying to push back a wave of memories. "My mother never spoke of anything like that. She barely spoke at all toward the end. But she did always keep a wooden box locked under her bed. I never saw what was in it. She knew it was dangerous," Ailey said softly. "That's why she never let you see it." "Then we need to find that box," Ewan said, "before they come again." But before anyone could move, a loud boom echoed through the walls. Not thunder. Something heavier. From the guard tower above, a bell began to ring, a sound they hadn't heard since the last time raiders breached their borders. "They're here," shouted one of the guards. "They've come in a storm." The hall erupted into motion. Swords unsheathed, arrows gathered, and children rushed below to the cellar with their mothers. But Lena didn't move. She looked at Blaine, then at the door. "This is because of me," she whispered. "No," Blaine said. "This was coming whether you were ready or not." Ewan grabbed his cloak. "We hold the gate. Ailey's, find that box. Lena, go with her. If what Blaine says is true, then what's inside may be the only way we survive this." The roar of hooves and shouting men grew louder. Torches lit the edge of the trees, casting wild shadows across the rain-soaked ground. Glenmore wasn't just under attack. It was being hunted. Lena and Ailey sprinted toward the old cottage. The wind howled so loud they couldn't hear their own footsteps. Inside, the little room looked untouched, like her mother had just stepped out and would return any minute. The bed still stood against the wall, and beneath it, the small wooden box sat, dark and locked with a rusted clasp. Ailey's pulled a key from her necklace. "Your mother gave this to me the night before she passed. She told me not to use it unless there was no other choice." She turned the key, and the lock clicked. Inside was a leather-bound journal, wrapped in cloth, and a rolled parchment sealed in red wax. The journal crackled as Lena opened it, revealing her mother's familiar script. The words made her breath catch. "To my daughter, if you are reading this, the danger I feared has come to Glenmore. The map inside leads to a vault. What it holds is older than any king and more dangerous than any army. Do not seek it unless you are willing to lose everything." Before Lena could speak, another crash rocked the ground. The outer gate was falling. Ailey's grabbed the parchment and looked at Lena. "It's your choice now. You can hide, or you can finish where your mother started." Outside, screams rang through the storm. The enemy had arrived, and the truth was only just beginning to surface. The silence that followed was heavier than any fog that had ever rolled down from the Highlands. Ewan stared at the aftermath, bloodied yet unbroken, and though he was surrounded by the smoke of burning hay and the groans of the wounded, it was the absence of sound, the stillness in his chest, that rang the loudest. All the pain, the fear, and the weight of survival converged into one breath as he turned toward the boy who had slipped from the shadows during the fighting. It was Callan. Callan, The boy who should have been far from this chaos now stood with a short blade in his hand and eyes that seemed far older than any child's. His tunic was torn, stained with mud and something darker. No one noticed him at first, but Ewan did. Their eyes met, and for a moment it felt like everything else fell away. "I followed you," Callan said, barely audible over the crackling fire. Ewan wanted to yell, to scold him for putting himself in danger. But instead, he knelt, drawing the boy close. "You should have stayed hidden." "I couldn't," Callan whispered. "I saw what they were doing. I couldn't." All around them, villagers tended to wounds and buried their dead. What had begun as an attempt to defend a small corner of Scotland had erupted into a confrontation that left no one untouched. But though the soldiers had been forced back, the threat wasn't over. Everyone knew that. This was just one raid. There would be more. More punishments. More marches from the southern lords. The people of Glenbrae stood at a terrible crossroads. The clan system that once protected them had been slowly fractured by royal politics, outside alliances, and betrayals that went unspoken. Now, with the old laws failing and fear rising, trust was harder to come by than bread. That night, a storm rolled in, as if the sky itself needed to grieve. Inside the stone roundhouse that served as their meeting hall, the elders gathered. Ewan sat near the center, eyes heavy, hands sore, but his voice steady. He recounted what had happened, but more importantly, what was coming. This wasn't just about food or taxes, he told them. It was a warning. They wanted us to break. Across the room, Moira stood by the wall. Though she rarely spoke during such gatherings, tonight her voice cut through the flickering candlelight like steel. "And yet we didn't. We bled, yes, but we didn't break. Not then. But we might still," another elder added grimly. "We've seen it before. Villages burned in the night. Names erased from records. Children taken and never seen again." Callan's face dropped at that. Ewan saw it. "We can't run," Moira said. "Not again." "So what do we do?" someone asked. "Fight every lord that marches north?" "No," Ewan replied quietly. "We prepare. We train. We hide what we must and defend what we can." "And if they bring more than just soldiers next time?" a farmer asked. "What if they bring the law with them? Clerks and courts and punishments that don't come with swords but scrolls?" That question hung in the air longer than anyone liked. Later, when the meeting ended and people scattered to their homes, Ewan sat outside beneath the rain. Callan joined him, wordless at first. "Why did you come, truly?" Ewan finally asked. Callan hesitated. "Because I wanted to see if people like us could really change anything." "And did we?" Ewan asked. "I don't know," the boy said honestly. "But we made them stop. For a little while." That answer stayed with Ewan long after Callan drifted asleep. It reminded him of something he'd nearly forgotten. That sometimes, in the middle of survival, people didn't need victory, they needed time. Time to hope. Time to breathe. Time to plan. In the days that followed, Glenbrae transformed. What was once a sleepy farming community became a village on alert. Scouts were sent out. Alliances sought quietly with nearby clans, even ones who hadn't spoken in years. Young people trained at dawn, and elders shared knowledge once considered old-fashioned. How to spot a spy, how to preserve food for months, how to disappear if needed. But even as the village grew stronger, a shadow stretched from the south. Word came of another lord, one with a reputation for cruelty and cunning. His name was Lord Hawthorne, and though he held lands further away, he had recently taken command of a string of outposts in the Highlands. Some said it was temporary. Others believed it was the start of a quiet conquest. One morning, a letter arrived. No seal, just folded parchment, damp from the journey. Ewan opened it carefully. Inside was a message written in tight, sharp script. "You've made noise. Noise attracts predators. Silence yourself before I do." It wasn't signed, but the threat was clear. Ewan handed the letter to Moira. She read it and folded it again slowly. "We don't know who sent it, but we know what it means," he said. That evening, they sat by the fire, speaking low so Callan wouldn't hear. But the boy wasn't asleep. He listened from the dark corner of the room, pretending to rest. "They want to scare us into submission," Ewan whispered. "They might try more than that," Moira replied. "Poison, sabotage, even turning our own against us. They already did once. Mora's eyes darkened. And they'll do it again if we don't stay ahead. But staying ahead was becoming harder. Supplies were stretched thin. A strange sickness had begun to spread among the cattle. And worse, some villagers began to whisper that maybe the fight wasn't worth it. That's when the second letter came. This one bore a seal. Lord Hawthorne's. Ewan opened it with a knife and read aloud. To the people of Glenbrae, you are invited to parley. Come to the stone hill south of the Black Hollow in 3 days. Bring no weapons. Come to speak or come to suffer the consequences of silence. It wasn't a request. Moira's face twisted in frustration. It's a trap. Maybe, Ewan said. But refusing might be worse. And if you go and don't come back? Ewan didn't answer. The next day was a blur of preparation. A few of the men offered to go in his place, but Ewan refused. He had led them this far. He'd finish it. Before dawn on the third day, he left with 2 scouts trailing behind at a distance. Callan tried to follow too, but Ewan turned and shook his head. Not this time. The boy stood in the mist, shoulders sagging. Ewan arrived at the stone hill as the sun broke through the clouds, casting a harsh light over the wild grass. There, already waiting, were 6 mounted soldiers in silver and black armor. And between them, a man in a long cloak, his face sharp and cold. Lord Hawthorne. He dismounted slowly, never breaking eye contact. So you're the one they say caused all this noise. I defended what was mine, Ewan said calmly. Hawthorne smiled, but there was no kindness in it. What's yours is a matter of record. And record, my friend, is something I happen to write. Ewan said nothing. You've stirred sentiment. Made people think they can survive without rule. You've made men brave. Brave men die young. And cowards live long enough to become tyrants, Ewan replied. The soldiers tensed, but Hawthorne held up a hand. You've spirit. I like that. So I'll give you a choice. Kneel. Pledge loyalty. And I'll let your village remain untouched. And if I don't, Hawthorne's smile widened. Then I write a different story. As the wind picked up, whipping through the heather, Ewan made his choice. But the story doesn't end there. Because what neither of them knew, what no one saw coming, was that someone else was already writing a different story altogether. And they were closer than anyone realized.